The streets were alive with the spirit of Christmas. Music drifted through the air as the first snowflakes gently fell from the sky. Laughter blended with the snowy landscape, creating a warm and festive atmosphere that seemed to embrace everyone around. Among the crowd, a small family walked happily together. Captivated by the sparkling lights, the young daughter looked up at her parents and declared that it was the happiest day of her life. Their joyful stroll suddenly came to a stop when a massive figure stepped directly into their path. The little girl lifted her eyes, filled with both surprise and admiration, as she gazed at the giant man standing before them. Our protagonist remained silent, staring back at the family, unsure of how to respond. After a brief moment of stillness, he continued walking alone through the crowded streets. Anger and deep loneliness weighed heavily on his heart. As he headed toward the subway station, his broad shoulders appeared more burdened and isolated than ever. Just as he started down the stairs, he suddenly stopped, as if something had caught his attention. Turning his head, he noticed a familiar lonely figure nearby. For the first time, he realized that someone else on the street seemed just as alone as he was. It was an elderly man dressed as Santa Claus, kneeling on the icy ground beneath the falling snow beside a sign that read, "Tell Santa your wish." Under normal circumstances, he would have ignored the sight completely. However, on this Christmas Eve, memories of the tragic accident that had taken his parents years ago came flooding back. The pain of being left alone resurfaced, stirring an unusual sense of compassion within him. He reached into his wallet, pulled out some money, and sat down beside the old man. Handing him a bill along with a carton of milk, he gently asked whether it was still good to drink. He carefully placed the gifts beside the sign, creating a small moment of warmth amid the freezing winter night. To his surprise, the old man suddenly grabbed his hand with remarkable strength and exclaimed that he was truly a kind person. Startled, the protagonist watched as the old man insisted on rewarding him and repeatedly begged him to make a wish. Embarrassed and irritated, he silently scolded himself for getting involved and demanded that the old man release his hand. Instead, the grip tightened even further. The protagonist was stunned. He had never considered himself physically weak, yet he found himself completely unable to break free. The old man stubbornly insisted that he had specifically come to grant the wish of someone as kind-hearted as him. Looking into the old man's eyes, he saw genuine desperation. The man claimed he could not return to Santa's village until he had fulfilled someone's wish. Realizing there was no easy escape, the protagonist finally sighed and asked if making a wish would allow him to leave. The old man eagerly nodded. After thinking for a moment and catching sight of his own reflection, he began to reveal what he wanted. At first, he jokingly wished to win the lottery, but the old man immediately rejected the idea, demanding a sincere wish that came from the heart. That request forced him to reflect deeply. A wave of sadness crossed his face as memories of his lonely past resurfaced. He realized that what he truly desired was a family, a home filled with people who would never leave him behind. With a crooked, bittersweet smile, he finally voiced his genuine wish. "I want a wife as beautiful as a rabbit and a daughter as adorable as a squirrel." Upon hearing those words, the old Santa took a deep breath, appearing deeply satisfied, as though he were savoring the longing and loneliness hidden within the man's soul. A strange smile spread across the old man's face. He claimed he was fortunate to have found someone who understood such feelings. Then, in an instant, his expression became unsettling. His eyes glowed with an eerie red light as he promised to provide a pure-hearted wife and an obedient daughter. Just as quickly as it had changed, his face softened once again. Giving the protagonist's hand one final squeeze, he sincerely wished him a happy life. Frightened by the old man's sudden transformation, the protagonist yanked his hand free and ran, convinced that the man was completely insane. Behind him, Santa's voice echoed through the snowy streets. He shouted that he would use every bit of his power to make the wish come true and that the entire Santa village stood behind him. Deeply shaken, the protagonist hurried into the subway station, desperate to put the bizarre encounter behind him. Sitting inside the train, his hands hung loosely between his knees while his thoughts spiraled in confusion. He looked around the nearly empty carriage, trying to convince himself that the old man's words were nothing more than the ramblings of a madman. Yet he could not ignore the fact that he had spoken aloud the deepest wish hidden in his heart. When his eyes landed on a poster showing a smiling family, his feelings only grew stronger. It reminded him just how desperately he longed for that elusive happiness. Eventually, the steady rumble of the night train made his eyes grow heavy, and he slipped into an uneasy sleep. During a hazy dream, a strange, unpleasant smell reached his nose, accompanied by a cold that seemed to penetrate deep into his bones. He suddenly woke with a start, confused and disoriented. What he saw next filled him with horror. He was completely naked. The freezing air brushed against his bare skin, and a powerful sense of fear gripped him as he took in his surroundings. In front of him, A horse-drawn wagon rattled along a dirt road through an unfamiliar village. Panic quickly set in when he realized he was trapped inside an iron cage, with heavy shackles fastened around his legs. Sitting beside him was a middle-aged man with long, tangled hair and a thick beard. However, he wasn't the only one there. The wagon was crowded with thin, exhausted people who looked as though they had suffered for a long time. As he observed the torn clothing, rusted iron bars, and primitive surroundings, a terrifying realization slowly sank in. Everything looked as if it belonged to the Middle Ages. Cold sweat covered his body as he struggled to accept the impossible situation before him. The men outside the cage spoke in a rough, unfamiliar language he couldn't understand. There were no familiar faces, no modern conveniences, and nothing that made sense. Whether this was a dream or a nightmare, one fact remained undeniable. He had been transported to another world. Time dragged painfully inside the cold, damp cage. Fighting the numbness creeping through his body from the icy floor, he forced himself to stay calm and assess the situation. Eventually, his attention shifted to a prisoner lying motionless in the corner. For a moment, he wondered whether the man was still alive. Then, reality struck him. The living had to do whatever was necessary to survive. Slowly crawling over, he whispered a quiet apology before removing the shirt from the unresponsive body. Wrapping the worn fabric around his bare back, he felt a small amount of warmth return. Behind him, the dead prisoner's body remained cold and exposed. It was a brutal and merciless beginning to his new life. The terrifying words of the crazed old Santa echoed repeatedly in his mind, and he couldn't help wondering if this was truly the way his wish was meant to come true. More than anything, he wanted to wake up. But the days passed one after another, and he remained locked inside the cage, traveling toward an unknown destination. After a week of endless movement, he finally pieced together the truth. First, they were all considered property. Second, the armed men escorting them were not prison guards. They were slave traders. The prisoners were being transported across the land to be sold to whoever offered the highest price. Whenever the wagon arrived at a village, the captives were forced into a line so local buyers could inspect them and choose those with the strongest bodies. Although accepting that he was a slave deeply wounded his pride, a small spark of hope remained. His physical strength was his greatest asset, and he believed someone would eventually purchase him and free him from the nightmare of the wagon. However, village after village passed without anyone choosing him. His confident smile gradually disappeared, replaced by a tired and forced expression. The hope he had clung to was slowly crushed beneath an overwhelming weight of despair. The wagon continued onward, carrying them farther into strange and desolate lands that felt increasingly distant from everything he once knew. Confined within the cramped cage, his body eventually reached its limit. Collapsing onto the floor, he questioned whether there was any reason left to keep living. In his feverish state, memories of his mother surfaced. He remembered her telling him to live his life to the fullest, no matter what hardships he faced. Images of his younger self, innocent and full of dreams, clashed painfully against the reality of his chains. Silently, he called out to his parents, wondering if he had the strength to survive even one more day. Then, suddenly, the image of the insane Santa appeared in his mind. A blazing surge of anger erupted within him. He no longer cared about happiness. He didn't care about this world. He simply wanted everything to end. Noticing a discarded metal fork on the floor, he grabbed it tightly. At that moment, happiness meant only one thing, the peace of death. But as he pressed the fork against his neck, he stopped. The last fragment of his determination refused to break. He would not die like an animal trapped in a cage. As his thoughts spiraled in chaos, his longing for a home resurfaced. Then a gentle, unfamiliar voice suddenly interrupted his despair. Looking up in surprise, he felt his breath catch in his throat. Through the bars of the cage, a hand reached toward him, offering a simple piece of bread. The hand belonged to a beautiful woman whose smile was so warm and kind that it seemed to shine like sunlight. She carefully placed the bread into his shaking hands and spoke softly in the strange language he still couldn't understand. A moment later, a small golden-haired girl peeked out from behind the woman's dress, staring at him with wide, curious eyes. The unexpected sight of the two of them overwhelmed him. The fork slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor with a metallic clang. Soon afterward, the wagon came to a stop in front of a cozy cabin hidden deep within a peaceful forest. The scene changed, and he found himself inside the home. The warmth of the cabin felt worlds apart from the cold iron cage. The woman and the little girl sat together at a simple wooden table, enjoying a meal beside the soft glow of a fireplace. The blonde child happily slurped her soup, her cheerful energy filling the room with life and warmth. As he watched the young girl eat, a shocking realization slowly dawned on him. A wife as beautiful as a rabbit, a daughter as adorable as a squirrel. The old man's promise had not been the meaningless ramblings of a lunatic after all. The repayment for his wish had begun. As the meal came to an end, the mother gently pushed her bowl toward her daughter, encouraging her to eat a little more. However, the little girl hesitated and looked up at her mother with wide, worried eyes. When the woman explained that she was giving up her portion because the child was hungry, the girl immediately protested. She argued that if she was hungry, then her mother, Ria, must be just as hungry as well. Showing wisdom far beyond her years, the little girl carefully divided the food into 2 equal portions and slid one bowl back toward her mother. For a moment, the woman sat frozen. A deep sense of warmth and happiness spread across her face as she accepted the gesture. Mother and daughter then continued eating together. Suddenly, a violent bang shook the door. A booming voice announced the arrival of the village chief. Before either of them could react, the door was kicked open. Terrified, the mother pulled her daughter into a desperate embrace. The chief coldly declared that, following the village council's decision, one of the men brought by the soldiers would become her new husband. She was ordered to prepare herself and accompany him to the mountain. Without waiting for a response, he turned and left, shouting one final command for her to bring food to the village gates at dawn to welcome the soldiers. Completely devastated, the woman collapsed to the floor. A flood of fear washed over her as painful memories of past beatings surged back into her mind. Trembling uncontrollably, she held the child tightly, knowing there was no escape from the cruel fate awaiting her. Looking down at the sleeping girl, she thought about how little time they had actually spent together. Yet, despite that, she knew she could never abandon her. With tears filling her eyes, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving the child to face the world alone once more. It was almost as if the girl could sense her mother's pain even while asleep. Tears began gathering in the child's eyes until she finally broke into a heartbreaking sob. The sound of crying echoed throughout the dark cabin. Mother and daughter clung to one another, sharing a grief so deep that it seemed to blend into the silence of the night. After the sobbing finally faded, the woman sat alone in the darkness, staring blankly ahead as she wondered what fate awaited her. Wrapped in the shadows, she made a silent and unbreakable vow. She would never again endure the horrors of her past. More importantly, she would never allow the innocent girl sleeping beside her to suffer the same fate. The child was only 5 years old, a small, helpless girl, and the daughter of the woman's late husband. As she sat there, painful memories resurfaced. She remembered the day her own father had sold her for nothing more than a rabbit skin. She remembered arriving at this very cabin for the first time, before she had even unpacked her few belongings. The man who was supposed to be her husband had beaten her. It had been a savage attack over something trivial. Her only mistake had been arriving slightly later than he expected. That moment became a cruel awakening, proving that her nightmare was only beginning. She remembered lying motionless on the freezing floor, believing that life could not possibly become worse. That was when the violent man's daughter approached her. The little girl stood nearby, silently watching her bruised and battered body with a complicated expression that was difficult to understand. In that living hell, the child with innocent eyes slowly moved closer and sat beside her. It was an awkward attempt at comfort, but it warmed her frozen heart. At that moment, she realized that the little girl was the only angel who had accompanied her through those dark years. Then one day, the violent man went hunting in the mountains and never returned. From that point onward, it was only the two of them against the world. The woman and the little girl remained together, bound by their shared struggle to survive in a world that offered them nothing. According to the villagers, the man had been torn apart by a pack of wolves deep within the forest. When she first learned of his death, she felt a brief sense of relief. However, that feeling was quickly replaced by a heavy sense of dread. Her gloomy expression reflected the harsh truth of her circumstances. In a lawless land like this, a woman without a husband was like a lost sheep separated from the flock, constantly vulnerable to the wolves of society. At dawn, the following morning, carrying a heavy heart, she led the little girl toward the village gates to face the future that the chief had chosen for her. As they walked, the child suddenly pointed ahead and excitedly called for her mother to look. A wagon carrying an iron cage stood nearby. Inside, a figure sat hunched in the shadows. The woman froze. Her heart began beating rapidly. As if guided by an invisible force, she took her daughter's hand and slowly approached the cage. When the man inside raised his head, she gasped. It was the same man to whom she had given bread before. Instantly, her eyes widened with fear as memories of the previous night returned. She remembered her late husband's face and the way he would strike and insult anyone he considered worthless. She also remembered the hollow despair in this prisoner's eyes when she had first seen him pressing a fork against his own throat. Just as those painful memories threatened to overwhelm her, the village chief appeared. With cold contempt, he mocked them for causing trouble so soon after their meeting. Growling angrily, He accused them of ruining his morning. His oppressive presence towered over the pair as they trembled in fear. Yet the image of the fork remained etched in the woman's mind. It awakened a deep sympathy within her because she understood that kind of desperation all too well. Meanwhile, the man could think only of the mother and daughter whose small act of kindness had literally saved him from death. Amid the confusion of emotions surrounding them, the woman quietly reached into her basket and pulled out another piece of bread. Keeping her head lowered to hide the feelings written across her face, she gently offered the bread to him once again. A small, flickering spark of humanity in a cruel world. The woman's kindness and the child's innocent warmth finally shattered his determination to end his life. He let the fork slip from his fingers and abandoned all thoughts of death. However, the village chief intervened once again, his voice as cold as winter itself. Snatching the basket from the woman's hands, he ordered her to return to the village immediately, stating that he would personally oversee the reception of the new slaves. Without protest, she obeyed. For her daughter's sake, she forced a fragile smile and pretended that everything was fine. Yet the little girl looked up with surprisingly perceptive eyes, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Inside the cage, Juan tightly clutched the bread, the last act of kindness he had received. Driven by overwhelming hunger, he quickly stuffed a piece into his mouth, desperate to regain some strength. But his meager meal was abruptly interrupted. Two soldiers suddenly stormed forward, shouting commands he couldn't understand. They violently dragged him from the cage and threw him onto the dirt road. The precious bread flew from his hands and landed in the mud. Juan and two other slaves were forced onto their knees before the village chief. With a cold expression, the chief announced that the selection process had begun. What happened next would change everything. The scene that followed was horrifying. Without hesitation, the soldiers drew their weapons and stabbed the other two slaves where they knelt. The brutal execution happened so quickly that neither man had a chance to resist. As their lives faded away, one of the soldiers dipped his finger into the fresh blood and began drawing strange symbols across several sheets of parchment. Immediately, the scrolls emitted an eerie blue glow. Juan watched in frozen terror. It was magic. Real, undeniable magic. Cold sweat poured down his body as he realized just how deeply he had been thrown into a world far darker and more dangerous than he had imagined. After a brief conversation between one of the soldiers and the chief turned his attention toward Juan, the sole survivor. Juan looked up, confused and frightened, completely unaware of what fate awaited him. Meanwhile, back at the small cabin, an elderly village woman arrived to visit Ria. She carried a heavy sack of supplies and instructed Ria to take it with her when she returned to the mountain house. The old woman explained that the village would provide food for a short period. However, she also gave a stern warning. Ria's new husband would not understand her language, and eventually, every favor the village provided would need to be repaid. Speaking frankly, the elderly woman admitted that nobody in the village had truly liked Ria's late husband. His violent behavior had only been tolerated because the village desperately needed hunters. But this situation was different. The man Ria was about to marry might appear to be an ordinary commoner, but according to the soldiers, his hands and feet were unusually soft and unscarred, more like those of a nobleman than a laborer. Taking Ria's hand, the old woman tried to comfort her. Based on Juan's unworked hands, she believed he wasn't a violent brute. If he proved hardworking, perhaps Ria and the child could finally enjoy a peaceful life. But Ria lowered her head and quietly wept. She told the old woman that she didn't dream of comfort or wealth. All she wanted was a husband who wasn't cruel. She would be perfectly content if the man simply allowed her and her daughter to live peacefully in a corner of the house. The following dawn, that fragile peace was shattered by violent pounding on the door. Ria jolted awake and immediately pulled her sleepy daughter into a protective embrace. Peeking through a narrow crack in the wooden wall, she was shocked to see the village chief approaching while dragging a man behind him. The chief burst into the cabin and loudly announced that he had brought the man she was supposed to marry. Ria gasped. The words "my husband" caught in her throat. As the chief barked orders for her to take him inside, Juan was shoved into the room. He stumbled forward, exhausted and disoriented, looking around in confusion. Seeing his injuries and exhausted condition, a rare flash of anger rose within Ria. She demanded to know why they were treating an injured man like an animal. In that instant, she realized that this battered stranger was the man destined to become her husband. Looking up at him, she trembled. His towering frame was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Juan tilted his head slightly, confused by her reaction. Then recognition struck him. This was the same woman who had offered him bread. His confusion only deepened. He couldn't understand why she seemed so frightened by his presence. Growing impatient, the village chief grabbed Juan's arm and scolded him for standing there motionless. Without waiting for an answer, he dragged the giant man toward the woman and child. The chief pushed Juan until he stood directly beside Rhea, arranging them like dolls. When both of them remained frozen with fear and uncertainty, he forcibly grabbed their hands and pressed them together. Interlocking their fingers, he grunted in satisfaction. According to him, they were now husband and wife. He told them not to be shy. Standing there with their hands forced together, the two strangers stared at one another. Both had lost so much. Both had been pushed into circumstances beyond their control. And now they found themselves bound together beneath the roof of a lonely cabin. Overwhelmed by confusion, Juan struggled to comprehend everything happening around him. Yet as the reality of the situation slowly settled in, an impossible thought suddenly crossed his mind. He remembered the old Santa's unsettling promise. A pure-hearted wife. An obedient daughter. Looking at Rhea's gentle appearance and delicate features, he couldn't help but imagine her as the rabbit-like bride described in his wish. For the first time since arriving in this strange world, he began to wonder whether the old man's promise had truly come true. The little girl, with her large round eyes and innocent expression, looked exactly like an adorable little squirrel. Juan could hardly believe it. Could that crazy old Santa really have granted his wish? Yet, even as the possibility settled into his mind, a deep sense of resentment rose within him. If this was truly the fulfillment of his wish, then the method was unbelievably cruel. Why couldn't the old man have granted it in a normal way? Why force him through so much suffering, humiliation, and despair first? Lowering his head, Juan's face disappeared beneath the shadow of his hair as silent anger began to build inside him. Grinding his teeth, he swore that if he ever met that Santa again, he would personally send him straight to hell. The intensity of his fury radiated outward like the presence of a ferocious bear. Unfortunately, the mother and daughter, his rabbit and squirrel, mistook his expression for hostility and instinctively shrank back in fear. After the forced marriage ceremony, the village chief and several other men led Juan into the nearby forest. The chief spent the entire journey shouting explanations at the top of his lungs, but Juan couldn't understand a single word of the unfamiliar language. Once the chief finished his lengthy speech, he turned toward the other villagers, as if they were discussing something important. Suddenly, a blonde-haired young man stepped forward and extended his hand. Assuming it was a greeting, Juan politely accepted the handshake. The moment their hands met, however, he felt an unusually powerful squeeze. It was clearly a test of strength. The blonde villager strained with all his might, his face twisting with effort, while Juan initially wondered if this was simply a strange local custom. As the challenge became obvious, Juan's eyebrows narrowed slightly. With nothing more than a casual squeeze of his own, he lifted the young man completely off the ground. The villager immediately screamed in panic as he dangled helplessly in the air. The sight was so shocking that even the village chief cried out in alarm. The blond man's hand quickly turned bright red under the pressure of Juan's overwhelming strength. When Juan finally released him, the young villager collapsed to his knees, clutching his throbbing hand. Meanwhile, the village chief launched into another frantic explanation. Without delay, he handed Juan a bow and a quiver of arrows. Juan accepted the weapons, wondering why they were being given to him. He correctly guessed that they weren't preparing him for another strength contest, but beyond that, he had no idea what they wanted. Seeing his confusion, the chief began acting things out with exaggerated gestures. At one point, he even mimicked the hopping motion of a rabbit. Finally, understanding dawned on Juan. They wanted him to hunt. Just as he thought he had figured everything out, the chief suddenly began waving his arms in panic, as though Juan had misunderstood completely. Pointing urgently toward a nearby bush, he shouted for Juan to shoot immediately. Following the direction of the chief's finger, Juan spotted a small white rabbit peacefully nibbling on leaves. He looked back in confusion. He had never touched a bough before in his life. Yet the chief continued shouting at him to fire. Reluctantly, Juan assumed what he believed was a professional-looking stance, though internally he had little confidence. After all, even skilled athletes miss targets, especially tiny moving ones. Despite his doubts, he released the string. The arrow shot forward with unbelievable force. It sliced through the air with a sharp whistle and struck the ground so closely that the frightened rabbit leaped away and disappeared into the bushes. Juan was certain he had missed. To his complete surprise, the village chief suddenly began celebrating. The man jumped excitedly and pointed toward the patch of ground where the rabbit had been standing moments earlier. He enthusiastically explained something in rapid-fire speech that Juan still couldn't understand. Completely baffled, Juan wondered why everyone seemed impressed by such an obvious failure. Then his attention was drawn elsewhere. A familiar figure appeared in the distance. Turning around, he froze. A bead of sweat rolled down his cheek as he saw Rhea and her daughter approaching. For a brief moment, reality finally settled into place. The gentle woman with a warm smile. The adorable little girl with bright eyes. This was the family he had wished for. His heartbeat quickened. An unexpected wave of shyness swept over him. A deep blush spread across the face of the giant man, leaving everyone around him utterly confused. Ria and her daughter were especially bewildered by the sudden change in his demeanor. Following that awkward introduction, the newly formed family shared their first meal together in a quiet clearing. Although a noticeable tension still lingered between them, they sat across from one another in silence. Ria prepared a simple but comforting meal, a bowl of hot soup filled with vegetables and fresh meat. As Juan prepared to eat, he couldn't stop glancing at the mother and daughter. He noticed the fear and uncertainty that still lingered in their eyes. Unfortunately, the simple act of him raising his spoon caused both of them to flinch. Juan immediately paused. Outwardly, his expression remained calm and unreadable. Inside, however, his heart pounded against his chest. Then something unexpected happened. A warm smile slowly appeared on his face, melting away the coldness he had carried for so many years. The word family echoed repeatedly in his mind. For most of his life, it had been a distant concept, something he had lost long ago. Yet somehow, despite all the chaos, he now had one again. The feeling was strange, but it was also comforting. Although he remained frustrated by the bizarre and painful journey that had brought him to this world, he couldn't deny the small spark of happiness growing inside him. Looking up at the sky, Juan let out a long breath. If he ever met that old Santa again, he still intended to teach him a lesson. Yet, beneath the irritation, a quiet sense of gratitude had begun to take root. The following day passed quickly. Accompanied by the village chief, the small family began the journey back to their home in the mountains. Juan effortlessly carried the heavy bags and supplies. Even so, he frequently looked back to check on Ria and her daughter, worried that they might struggle to keep pace. From where he stood, both of them already appeared exhausted despite having traveled only a short distance. The language barrier frustrated Juan deeply. He felt helpless, unable to ask how the mother and daughter were doing or offer them even the simplest words of comfort. Turning forward once more, his expression hardened with determination. He silently promised himself that he would adapt to this unfamiliar world as quickly as possible. Suddenly, he stopped walking. A firm resolve took root in his heart. He remembered a lesson his mother had taught him when he was a child. If you want to protect someone, don't hesitate. The moment you feel the urge to help them, run to their side immediately. Holding tightly to those words, Juan made up his mind. Without hesitation, he turned around and walked straight back toward Ria and her daughter. The pair watched him approach with wide eyes. His sudden change in direction frightened them. The little girl's eyes quickly filled with tears, and her lower lip trembled as she struggled not to cry. Wanting to reassure her, Juan slowly lowered himself onto one knee. He softened his expression as much as possible, hoping to show that he meant no harm. All he wanted was to comfort them and prove that they had nothing to fear from him. Unfortunately, his massive size and unexpected approach only made Ria even more nervous. Unable to understand his intentions, she pressed her hands together and whispered desperate pleas for mercy. Her reaction left Juan completely confused. Seeing her mother's fear, the little girl finally broke down and burst into tears. Juan let out a long sigh. He realized that his mere presence was enough to frighten them. At that moment, he decided he could no longer hide behind a cold and unreadable expression. Speaking a single word of permission despite knowing they wouldn't understand it, he carefully reached out and placed a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. Then he did something extraordinary. Using his incredible strength, he lifted both of them effortlessly as though they weighed almost nothing. Mother and daughter froze in shock. With remarkable care, Juan adjusted his grip, settling Ria securely against one shoulder while cradling the little girl in his other arm. His expression remained calm and steady. Ria stared at him in disbelief. She couldn't comprehend the immense strength contained within this man's body. Despite his overwhelming power, he moved with surprising gentleness. One arm supported her while the other protected the child. He stood as solid and dependable as a mountain. The little girl's fear quickly transformed into excitement. A small gasp of wonder escaped her lips. Looking down at her, Juan felt a warm sense of responsibility bloom within his chest. Turning slightly toward Ria, he spoke softly and told her to hold on tightly. As he continued walking, he was surprised to discover that carrying both of them along with the luggage didn't feel difficult at all. At that moment, he made another silent vow. He would learn the local language. He would become the greatest hunter in the region. And he would make certain that his family never lacked food again. Feeling Ria's small hand cautiously grip his shoulder, Juan realized that his future would likely be exhausting and filled with responsibilities. Yet it would also be filled with a kind of hope he had never experienced before. As they traveled through the forest, he felt the warmth of her body against him. A bead of sweat rolled down his neck. Then, unexpectedly, he felt a soft touch. A timid hand rested gently against him. Without saying a word, Juan raised his own hand and covered hers. It was a simple gesture, yet it created a silent connection between two strangers. In that moment, much of the fear between them seemed to fade. A growing sense of comfort replaced it as mother and daughter found safety against his broad frame. Without a single complaint, Juan carried them for the remainder of the journey. Following behind the village chief, they eventually reached the mountain cabin. The chief appeared grateful for Juan's endurance and told him to rest before finally disappearing into the thick mountain mist. Juan stood quietly, watching the man's silhouette vanish. For the first time, he was truly alone with his new family. Looking up at the wooden cabin that would become his home, he couldn't help comparing it to his old attic apartment. If anything, this place looked even colder. Memories of the freezing iron cage where he had spent so many miserable days resurfaced, reigniting his hatred for the bitter cold. Shaking away those unpleasant thoughts, he took a deep breath. This was a new beginning. Placing his hand on the door, he slowly pushed it open and stepped inside with hope in his heart. Then he froze. Ria was standing inside. Her face was filled with confusion, and her cheeks were bright red. When he noticed the fresh tears glistening on her face, concern immediately surged through him. He hurried over and began asking what was wrong. Why was she crying? What had happened? But she couldn't understand a single word he said. Without warning, Ria turned and ran out the door. Juan stood there in stunned silence. Slowly, he turned his attention back toward the interior of the cabin. His blood ran cold. The house was completely empty. Not only were the furnishings gone, but even the shelves had been ripped from the walls. Juan stood motionless, unable to process the cruel reality before him. While Ria and her daughter had been waiting at the village gates, the neighbors had treated the cabin like a treasure chest waiting to be looted. They had stolen everything. Furniture, tools, supplies. Anything useful had been taken. Outside, Ria curled into herself, trembling from both the mountain cold and overwhelming despair. Without tools, they couldn't repair the house. Without weapons, they couldn't defend themselves from wild animals. They were completely vulnerable. When Juan eventually found her sitting alone in the shadows, he quietly acknowledged her presence. Without saying anything else, he sat down beside her. He left enough space to respect her boundaries while sharing the heavy silence that surrounded them. As he watched her cry, something inside him softened. Slowly and gently, he reached out and stroked her hair. It was a simple act of comfort, but in that moment, it served as a silent balm for her wounded heart. The gentle touch of his hand made her sobs falter, and she lifted her tear-filled, astonished eyes toward him. He gave her a small, comforting smile, trying to show that she had nothing to fear. For a brief moment, it seemed she truly sensed the honesty in his gaze. Even so, uncertainty still lingered across her face. This was the man she was expected to spend her life with. Yet they could not even communicate with one another, and her supposed protector appeared to know nothing about hunting. Surrounded by such a harsh and unforgiving wilderness, she wondered whether they could really survive. Unlike Rigi, whose worries continued to grow, Juan wore a faint but confident smile. Looking directly into her eyes, he silently promised that he would protect her no matter what. Though she still carried fear and doubt, his determination never wavered. With great care, he gently held Rigi's cheeks in his hands, a gesture filled with respect and reassurance. A tear slid down her face, but this time it was not caused by fear. Instead, it came from the unfamiliar feeling of warmth and trust that was beginning to blossom beneath the fading glow of the setting sun. As the tear fell, a rare sense of peace filled Rigi's heart. She found herself wondering why the presence of this stranger felt so unexpectedly comforting. Juan's thoughts drifted back to his former world, where he had lived alone ever since losing his parents. He had spent his entire life fighting just to survive, and his hand instinctively clenched into a fist as a reminder of the strength that had carried him this far. Now, for the first time, he had a family. That realization gave him even greater reason to stand firm against every hardship. He struck his chest with determination and silently vowed to do whatever it took to provide for them. That unspoken promise became the final straw for Rigi. The emotional barrier she had built finally collapsed, and she burst into uncontrollable tears. Without saying a word, Juan pulled her gently toward him, allowing her to rest her head against his broad shoulder and release all the pain she had been carrying. At that very moment, the little girl, who had been watching from a distance, rushed toward them in a burst of protective anger. She wrapped her small arms around Rigi from behind and shouted for Juan to stop upsetting her mother. In an instant, all three of them became tangled together in an awkward but heartfelt embrace. It was the first time they truly looked like a complete family. As Juan held the crying woman, he experienced a feeling unlike anything he had ever known before. The little girl soon began crying as well, and countless questions raced through his mind. He wondered who her father was, why this woman had shared her precious bread with him despite having so little, and what painful events had brought her to tears. In the end, he pushed those questions aside. He believed that if they worked hard together, they could become a happy family. Holding them both tightly, he made one final promise to himself. He would make them happier than anyone else in the world. He would never allow them to cry again. He would become the greatest husband and father this world had ever seen. No matter what it took, he would ensure that they would never regret accepting him as part of their family. After the emotional moment passed, the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, casting long shadows around the small wooden cabin that would serve as their home. However, once they returned inside, the three of them found themselves sitting across from one another in the same awkward silence as before. Juan had expected that their embrace would bring them closer together, yet it felt as though they had somehow returned to the beginning. To Rigi, this man remained a complete mystery. He was still a stranger in every sense of the word. Nevertheless, she understood that they would have to learn how to live together, even if neither of them knew where to start. Suddenly, an idea came to Juan. Snapping his fingers to get their attention, he leaned forward slightly, determined to break the uncomfortable barrier between them. Pointing to his chest, he introduced himself in a clear and steady voice. Kim Juan, he said, repeating the name slowly. Kim Juan. He hoped that even if they could not hold a conversation, they could at least learn each other's names. The idea worked. Rigi looked up in surprise and softly repeated the sounds after him. Encouraged by her response, Juan extended his hand and silently asked for her name in return. She hesitated for a moment before quietly answering. Rigi. Then she repeated it once more clearly and confidently. Rigi. Juan's face brightened with a smile. Rigi. What a beautiful name. He then turned toward the little girl and gently asked for her name as well. The child remained silent. Instead, she curled closer to her mother's side. The reaction struck Juan as strange. Looking into her innocent yet somewhat vacant eyes, he suddenly realized something. Perhaps she had never been given a name at all. A deep sense of sympathy filled his heart. Without hesitation, he gently stroked her hair and decided to give her a name of his own. Dorothy, he said. The name reminded him of the brave girl from The Wizard of Oz, a girl who embarked on a great adventure with loyal companions, fought for her happiness, and earned the love of everyone she met. The child attempted to repeat it, but the unfamiliar sounds tangled on her tongue. Dorothy. Juan chuckled softly and explained that it was a name that would bring her friendship and affection. Hearing that, the girl's face lit up with a bright smile. This time, she pronounced it perfectly. Dorothy. With that, they were finally ready to begin their new life together. Juan immediately got to work. His axe struck the wood with strong, decisive swings. From a distance, Rigi watched him quietly, continuing to ponder the mystery of this unusual man. He possessed a powerful physique and far greater strength than either of her late husbands. Yet, despite that strength, he was remarkably gentle and considerate toward her. He was unlike anyone she had ever known. To her, he seemed as though he belonged to an entirely different world. In a soft voice, she called out, "You." Although she had no idea where he came from, simply saying his name felt strangely warm and pleasant. Throughout her entire life, no one had ever treated her with such kindness, not even once. It made her wonder why this man was being so gentle with her. No matter how closely she observed him, Juan seemed completely out of place in this harsh and isolated land. Suddenly, he turned around, smiled, and called her name. Rigi. At that moment, something caught her attention. His dark hair and deep eyes resembled the descriptions from an old rumor she had heard. There were stories about a nation at war that had supposedly summoned a legendary hero, a man known for having black hair and black eyes. A startling thought flashed through Rigi's mind. Could the legendary hero truly be standing before her? As Juan walked closer, she found herself comparing him to the hero from those tales. Yet despite the similarities, doubt lingered in her heart. Surely a legendary hero would never appear in a forgotten village so far removed from the rest of the world. Besides, the story itself was nothing more than an unverified rumor. As he approached, Rigi felt a shy flutter in her chest and tilted her head upward to look at the tall, imposing man before her. A mixture of uncertainty and hope filled her heart, though she was almost afraid to admit it. Looking more carefully, she realized his hair was actually a deep shade of brown rather than pure black. His eyes carried the same earthy color. Rigi released a long, quiet sigh of relief. He was probably just a man blessed with exceptional strength. Then another thought struck her. Why did she feel so calm and reassured around someone she had met only today? Confusion colored her flushed cheeks, giving her a timid yet gentle appearance. Without warning, Juan reached out and softly patted her head. The simple gesture left her frozen. She had never experienced anything like it before. In her painful past, whenever a man's hand approached her head, it usually meant pain and violence would follow. But Juan's hand merely brushed through her hair with a tenderness she had never known. Instead of shrinking away in fear, she felt safe. More than that, she silently wished the feeling would never end. For a brief moment, a powerful desire rose within her. She wanted him to continue stroking her hair forever. Noticing the subtle change in her expression, Juan stepped a little closer. Bathed in this newfound warmth, Reggie's face glowed with a peace and happiness she rarely displayed. Then, without warning, Juan slowly leaned forward and closed the distance between them. His lips gently touched hers. Reggie's eyes widened in complete shock, yet she did not move away. In that single moment, every worry and every barrier separating them seemed to disappear, leaving behind only the sweetness of their first kiss. The instant it ended, Juan pulled back as though startled by his own actions. His face turned bright red. Unable to find the right words, he stammered awkwardly while his hands searched for something to do. His embarrassment was impossible to hide. Desperate to escape the awkward atmosphere, he grabbed a nearby wooden bucket as an excuse. Holding tightly to the handle as if it were his last source of composure, he turned around and hurried toward the stream without saying a word. Reggie remained standing where she was. Her face burned with heat, and her heart raced wildly as she continued to savor the lingering sweetness of the kiss. Meanwhile, Juan walked along the water's edge, mentally scolding himself for acting so impulsively. His nerves were in complete disarray. Although they appeared to be husband and wife, they were still strangers who had met only a few hours earlier. The more he thought about it, the more distressed he became. They couldn't even communicate properly. He had no idea how to navigate a relationship under such unusual circumstances. Lost in thought, he wandered aimlessly, searching for a way to clear his mind. Without realizing it, he traveled farther than intended. Then, suddenly, a chilling howl echoed through the darkness of the forest. The sound shattered the night's silence. Juan immediately snapped back to reality. Pushing aside his distractions, he reminded himself that he needed to collect water and return home quickly. But then a cold shiver ran down his spine. Sweat formed on his forehead. From the dense shadows of the forest, a gigantic wolf slowly emerged. Its eyes glowed with a fierce crimson light. The beast stepped directly into his path, letting out a low growl while exposing rows of razor-sharp fangs. This was no ordinary animal. It was a true predator of the wilderness. Juan instinctively stepped backward, his body drenched in cold sweat. The wolf's killing intent was unmistakable. Every instinct screamed that this creature was a ruthless hunter. Standing perfectly still, he tightened his grip on the bucket and forced himself to remain calm. Yet, rather than surrendering to fear, he slowly crouched down and set the bucket aside. His eyes never left the wolf. Nearby, he spotted a fallen log and quickly seized it. Crude as it was the only weapon available. Gripping it with all his strength, he prepared himself for a battle that could decide life or death. The wolf attacked first. Moving with terrifying speed, it launched itself toward him. Juan surged forward as well. Using the log as a shield, he blocked the creature's deadly bite. The impact sent violent vibrations through his entire body. The force behind the attack was overwhelming. Every muscle strained as he fought to hold his ground. But the wolf was not merely powerful. It was savage. A cry of pain escaped Juan's lips as the beast hurled him backward. He slammed into a tree with tremendous force, leaving him dizzy and seeing flashes of light. Even then, he refused to give up. With a roar born from pure instinct and determination, Juan charged forward once again, reaching desperately for the wolf's throat. Juan clenched his jaw, refusing to accept death in such a desolate place. Every ounce of his determination and survival instinct gathered into a single desperate stand. His eyes blazed with the resolve of a man standing at the edge of defeat. With a fierce roar, he prepared to end the battle once and for all. The moment he struck, a scorching pain surged through his arm, as though an unknown force was draining his very life. Then, suddenly, a sharp metallic sound echoed through the night. To his complete astonishment, a brilliant golden light burst from his palm. The wolf growled menacingly, but the flames dancing in Juan's hands seemed even more savage. The blazing fire engulfed the beast while Juan stared in utter disbelief. The flames erupted with a ferocity and power he had never imagined he possessed. Seizing the opportunity, he scrambled onto the wolf's back and poured every bit of this newfound energy into his burning fist. Determined to bring down the predator, he unleashed a devastating punch empowered by fire. The explosive attack shattered the silence of the night. The wolf collapsed instantly, its life extinguished in a single blow. Only a dark pool of blood remained upon the ground. Even after the beast had fallen, Juan continued throwing punches into the empty air. His body was still running on pure adrenaline, releasing the tension that had built up during the fight. Finally exhausted, he dropped onto the grass and stared at his hands in shock. He was certain they'd been engulfed in flames. Yet when he raised them beneath the moonlight, his skin was unharmed and his clothes showed no sign of burning. The entire experience defied explanation. Lying there in stunned silence, he struggled to comprehend the fact that he had just used magic. His mind drifted back to the strange blood rituals performed by the soldiers. In countless stories he had read, traveling to another world and gaining supernatural powers was a common theme. Perhaps, he thought, he had become one of those protagonists. Filled with excitement, he raised his hand toward the sky and shouted, "Invoke fire." Nothing happened. Only the rustling of leaves answered him. Undeterred, he tried again. And again. His voice grew increasingly desperate as he attempted more elaborate techniques. Firestorm. Flame wall. Dragon's breath. Spirit of the earth, arise. Despite all his efforts, nothing occurred. Eventually, Juan flopped back onto the grass in disappointment. Still, he knew what had happened wasn't an illusion. The injuries he had suffered from crashing into the tree had already begun to heal. Looking up at the star-filled sky, he realized this mysterious power could become his greatest advantage. It would help him hunt, provide food, and protect his family. A smile spread across his face as he imagined a future where Reggie and Dorothy could live comfortably and happily. In a remote village without doctors, magical healing alone would be a priceless blessing. Determined to uncover the truth, Juan sat upright once more. If the power had awakened once, then it could awaken again. As the night grew quiet around him, painful memories began resurfacing. Not long after losing his parents, he had also lost his grandfather, the only person who had genuinely cared for him. Although his grandfather had been healthy for his age, he died in a tragic accident, leaving Juan at the mercy of cruel relatives. The memory of the funeral remained vivid. One relative had stormed in and struck him, screaming that he was cursed and responsible for the deaths of his father and brother. From that day onward, everyone treated him like a walking disaster. Yet he had been nothing more than a high school student struggling to survive. Returning to the present, Juan glanced at the wolf's corpse and gave a faint, tired smile. He pushed those painful memories aside. Lifting the enormous beast onto his shoulders, he knew he needed to return home before other predators caught the scent of blood. Skinning the wolf would be difficult, but it could be done. His thoughts returned once more to his grandfather. Yet he remembered watching the old man prepare chickens and rabbits on the family farm. Looking up at the moon, Juan felt certain that his grandfather would have been proud of him. Still, one question remained unanswered. How was he supposed to control this mysterious dormant magic? Back inside the warm cabin, Reggie and Dorothy were preparing dinner. Dorothy eagerly carried a bowl over to Reggie, her small face shining with anticipation. Smiling warmly, Reggie accepted it and thanked her daughter. The praise caused Dorothy's face to light up with a smile as bright as the morning sun. After helping her mother, the little girl happily skipped around the cabin, playing near the glowing fireplace. Then a strange noise from outside caught her attention. Curious, she stood on her tiptoes and peered through the window. Tilting her head, she tried to identify the shape moving through the darkness. Suddenly, a gigantic wolf appeared before her eyes. Dorothy let out a terrified scream. The frightened girl stumbled backward and fell to the floor. Reggie's heart nearly stopped. Calling out to her daughter, she immediately grabbed a worn kitchen knife. It was a poor weapon, but it was the only means she had to protect her child. Without hesitation, she rushed toward the door, shouting for Dorothy to stay behind her. When she flung the door open, the sight before her froze her in place. Cold sweat ran down her body. There stood Juan. He was kneeling on the ground with the enormous carcass of a wolf draped across his shoulders. Exhaustion was written all over his face. Mistaking the scene entirely, Reggie believed the wolf was attacking him. Overcome with fear, she screamed his name and charged forward. Seeing them rush outside, Juan looked up in confusion and called out to them. But Reggie didn't stop. Holding her knife high, she prepared to defend the man she cared about. Only when she realized the wolf was already dead did she freeze. The knife slipped from her fingers. A powerful wave of embarrassment washed over her. Rushing to Juan's side, she wrapped her arms around him and frantically checked for injuries, desperately asking whether he was hurt. Startled by their reaction, Juan quickly assured them that he was unharmed. A moment later, Dorothy rushed over and wrapped her arms around his legs, tears still shining in her worried eyes. Juan smiled gently, doing his best to calm them both. He explained that the wolf had only managed to scratch his hand and that the injury was nothing serious. Repeatedly stroking their heads, he continued, reassuring them that he was perfectly fine until their breathing finally steadied. Overcome with relief, Rigi held tightly onto him, softly murmuring words he could not understand. Juan embraced her in return, imagining she was offering thanks to the heavens for his safe return. Dorothy continued crying, and Juan guessed she was trying to tell him how frightened she had been. Holding both of them close, he silently blamed himself for causing them so much worry. After some time, the three returned inside. Yet the harsh call of a crow perched on the roof seemed to warn that their peace would not last forever. Outside in the shed, Juan began the difficult task of skinning the wolf. Using a sharpened knife, he carefully separated the hide from the flesh with steady, practiced movements. Although he made it appear simple, he quickly discovered that the work demanded far more effort and time than he had expected. Wiping sweat from his forehead, he decided that he would need to find a more efficient method in the future. Even so, he continued working without complaint. After all, his family needed food. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Rigi. She softly called his name. Surprised to see her there, Juan turned around and greeted her cheerfully before stepping closer to find out what she wanted. Rigi placed a wooden bucket in front of him and gestured toward the meat. She pointed at the fresh cuts, then mimicked various animals and motions, trying her best to explain herself. After a moment, understanding dawned on Juan. She wanted him to place the meat in the bucket so it could be processed and stored properly. As he looked at her, another thought occurred to him. He needed to learn how to communicate with her more effectively. Searching through his memory, he tried to recall how to say thank you in her language. After a brief hesitation, he awkwardly attempted the pronunciation. Goma, he said uncertainly. Rigi's eyes widened. Then a bright smile spread across her face. Her reaction completely confused Juan, making him wonder if he had accidentally said something strange. Looking up at him warmly, Rigi gently corrected his pronunciation and repeated the proper word. The two stood there for a long moment, closer than either expected. A feeling of quiet understanding lingered between them. Smiling sincerely, Juan repeated the word correctly this time. Rigi replied that it was nothing. The simple exchange left her strangely emotional. She didn't know how to react. No one in her own family had ever thanked her for even the smallest thing. For Rigi, this simple act of gratitude was another first. Then the memory of their earlier kiss suddenly surfaced. Her cheeks immediately turned crimson. A mixture of embarrassment and curiosity surged through her heart. Unable to handle the overwhelming emotions, she quickly turned and hurried away. As she ran, she couldn't stop wondering whether Juan had ever kissed another woman before. The thought alone made her chest ache. The intensity of her feelings was almost enough to bring tears to her eyes. Later, the two returned to the shed and resumed their work in silence. The calm atmosphere settled around them. As they processed the meat together, Rigi found herself reflecting on how unusual Juan truly was. Traditionally, preparing meat was considered a woman's responsibility. Yet Juan handled the task naturally and skillfully. Why was he so different? Despite her confusion, the pair worked side by side with surprising harmony. As her thoughts wandered once more, Rigi questioned the strange feelings growing inside her. Was this what love felt like? Without realizing it, she slowly closed her eyes. Perhaps some part of her had begun to expect something. When Juan noticed, he gently leaned forward and kissed her forehead. The soft touch filled her heart with warmth and happiness. Almost immediately, she pulled back. Embarrassed, she scolded herself for foolishly assuming he intended to do more. Juan remained still, watching her with calm and gentle eyes. Meanwhile, Rigi internally panicked. Did he think she had been asking for another kiss? Determined not to create any further misunderstandings, she lifted her head and kept her eyes wide open. This time, however, Juan leaned in again. And unlike before, it was a genuine kiss. The unexpected gesture caught her completely off guard. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were filled with affection, respect, and a tenderness that made her heart tremble. Slightly embarrassed himself, Juan quickly lifted the bucket of meat. Then he noticed something. Dorothy was nowhere to be seen. Confused, he called out for her. A moment later, he discovered the little girl peeking through the doorway. She had witnessed the entire exchange. The realization hit both adults instantly. With a shriek of overwhelming embarrassment, Rigi fled into the house and disappeared from sight, desperate to hide her burning face. After the awkward incident passed, the small family decided to take a walk through the forest. Rigi led the way while Juan and Dorothy followed behind, creating a peaceful picture of family life. Along the path, Dorothy happily skipped ahead before suddenly stopping and stretching out her small hands. It looked as though she wanted to help carry the heavy bucket. Juan smiled warmly at the adorable gesture and thanked her. Instead of smiling back, Dorothy frowned. Confused, Juan stared at her for a moment before finally understanding. He had forgotten to use her name. Kneeling down, he looked at her affectionately. "Thank you, Dorothy." The moment she heard her name, her face lit up with pure happiness. Her smile shone as brightly as the midday sun. Filled with excitement, Dorothy eagerly helped her new father push the heavy bucket along the path. Back at the cabin, Rigi gently ran her fingers across the wolf's fur, thoughtfully stroking the hide while reflecting on everything that had happened. The wolf hide now hung proudly inside the cabin, a symbol of Juan's strength and courage. Sitting across from it, Juan briefly wondered why Rigi wanted to keep such a strong-smelling pelt inside their home. Then it occurred to him that the hide likely carried a special meaning for her. Watching the way she admired it filled him with quiet satisfaction. Rigi and Dorothy sat beside the pelt together. Curious as ever, Dorothy reached out and ran her tiny hand through the soft fur. Then, in an adorable display of innocence, she picked up a small stone and began combing the wolf's fur with great seriousness. The sight made Rigi smile warmly. It was a simple moment, yet it radiated happiness and domestic peace. Juan found himself smiling as well, easily drawn into their shared joy. A short while later, Rigi stepped outside to prepare dinner. She carefully arranged several cuts of fresh meat. The rich red steaks, carved with patience and precision, promised a filling and nourishing meal. Juan watched attentively. Realizing this was one of the methods people use to preserve food in this world, he made a mental note to learn the process himself. His eyes drifted toward a small portion of animal fat he had managed to save. Seeing how pleased Rigi was with it made him smile. He was glad his instinct to keep it had proven useful. Still, the reality of his situation weighed heavily on his mind. There was so much he still needed to learn about this unforgiving world. He had to understand what people valued, how trade worked, and what goods were considered important. The sooner he adapted, the better he could provide for his family. With that determination, Juan stood up, ready to return to work. Before he could take a step, Rigi stopped him. Concern was written all over her face. She gestured anxiously, urging him to sit back down and rest. Juan responded with a reassuring smile and gently shook his head. He tried to show her that he felt much better and that his body had already recovered from the earlier battle. Placing a hand softly on her shoulder, he reassured her that he would not push himself too hard. After a moment of hesitation, Rigi finally nodded and allowed him to go. Taking his axe, Juan headed toward the forest. He searched for a medium-sized tree that would be suitable for cutting. He remembered hearing that oak made excellent firewood, although he still had no idea how to identify one properly. Relying on his natural strength, he raised the axe and delivered a powerful swing. The strike displayed his remarkable physical power. Unfortunately, he put a little too much force behind it. The axe slipped from his grasp and went spinning wildly through the air. Juan immediately grabbed his head in disbelief. He couldn't believe he had made such a foolish mistake. After searching for the runaway axe and gathering wood for some time, he finally collected enough firewood to keep the cabin warm. Loading the heavy bundle onto his back, he happily made his way home. When he arrived, he found Rigi and Dorothy waiting for him with worried expressions. Before he could ask what was wrong, Rigi hurried over, grabbed his hand, and pulled him inside. She sat him down without explanation, leaving Juan completely confused. Then she carefully took his rough hands into her own and began wiping away the dirt and grime. Juan felt a little embarrassed by the attention while Dorothy watched curiously nearby. Suddenly, the little girl's eyes lit up with inspiration. She dashed away as though struck by a brilliant idea. Running to a basin, Dorothy filled a small container with water using her tiny hands. The task proved difficult. Water splashed everywhere, leaving little puddles behind her. Even so, she proudly carried it back. Without hesitation, she dumped the water directly onto Juan. The unexpected help left him completely soaked. Rather than becoming upset, Juan simply smiled. There was no way he could be angry at such an adorable daughter. Watching the scene unfold, Rigi burst into laughter. The cabin quickly filled with warmth and joy. Dorothy, however, looked slightly disappointed, as though she had expected a more dramatic reaction. Seeing her expression, Juan knelt beside her and gently patted her head. He thanked her warmly for trying to help. At once, Dorothy brightened and spun around, ready to run off and assist him again. Alarmed by the prospect, Juan quickly jumped to his feet to stop her before another flood occurred. Rigi laughed even harder at the charming chaos unfolding before her. At that moment, she felt as though she were living inside a beautiful dream. Only a few days earlier, she had believed happiness was forever beyond her reach. Now that she had finally found it, she wanted nothing more than to protect the smiles of Juan and Dorothy for the rest of her life. As evening settled in, a thin column of smoke rose from the cabin's chimney and curled gently into the sky. It stood as a silent symbol of hope and the beginning of a new chapter for their little family. That night, the three gathered around the table to share a hearty meal. Dorothy, however, had already succumbed to exhaustion and fallen asleep. Even so, Juan and Rigi occasionally looked at one another across the table. Though neither spoke, a new warmth and understanding had begun to grow between them. After dinner, Dorothy slept peacefully, with her thumb tucked into her mouth. The innocent sight made both Juan and Rigi smile softly. Moments like these were precious. Carefully, Juan lifted the sleeping child into his arms. After an entire day of adventures and excitement, she remained completely lost in her dreams. While Rigi quietly cleared away the remains of dinner, Juan carried Dorothy toward the bed. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the cabin with a comforting warmth. With the utmost care, he laid Dorothy down and gently covered her with a blanket. This simple gesture overflowed with fatherly affection. Only after making certain she was comfortable did he step away. He then moved toward the courtyard, where flickering candlelight illuminated a quiet corner of the patio. Inside the cabin, Rigi continued her evening chores, washing dishes beside the warm glow of the firelight. Juan stepped inside quietly, careful not to interrupt Rigi while she worked. Yet, before he could think twice, he reached out and gently took her hand. The unexpected gesture caught her completely off guard. Rigi looked up, her cheeks instantly turning red as her heart began to race. Juan himself felt confused by his actions. It was as though an invisible force kept drawing them closer together. For a moment, the world seemed to fall silent. Slowly, he pulled her into a gentle embrace. Nestled against his chest, Rigi gazed up at him with flushed cheeks, still holding the damp cloth she had been using. In a quiet display of affection, she carefully wiped the sweat from the back of his neck. Though her heart pounded wildly, she encouraged herself to stay calm. After all, she believed this was simply something a wife should do for her husband. Gathering a little courage, she carefully lifted the edge of his shirt to dry the perspiration on his stomach. The innocent act made both of them unexpectedly nervous. Rigi struggled to contain her embarrassment, while Juan responded with a warm, affectionate smile. His eyes softened, carrying a gentle and playful warmth. Even so, the intimacy felt almost overwhelming to her. Sensing her uncertainty, Juan gently took her hand again. The simple gesture was filled with quiet tenderness. Looking directly into her eyes, he created a moment so sincere that Rigi felt her heart skip a beat. Then he leaned closer and softly suggested that it was time to rest. Hand in hand, they entered the cabin's only bedroom. He guided her toward the bed with a gaze full of affection. Beneath the dim lantern light, their eyes met. Rigi remained shy, but she did not pull away. Her heart beat so loudly that she was certain he could hear it. Juan looked at her and silently thanked fate for bringing them together. He prayed that they would never be separated and wished for the chance to protect both her and Dorothy for the rest of his life. In this humble village, it was completely normal for an entire family to share a single room. As Rigi lay there, she remembered the stories she had heard about wedding nights. Painful memories soon followed. She recalled her violent father and the fear that had haunted her childhood. His threats and cruelty had left scars that never truly faded. She remembered hearing her mother's cries late into the night after terrible arguments and wondering whether her own future would one day become the same. But the next morning brought something entirely different. She awoke to the comforting sound of firewood crackling in the hearth. Opening her eyes slowly, she found herself in a world that felt far gentler than the one she had always known. She was lying between Juan and Dorothy. For a moment, she blinked in surprise. Her head rested on Juan's arm. Beside her, Dorothy slept peacefully against his other side, surrounded by warmth and safety. A long sigh of relief escaped Rigi's lips. The night she had feared for so many years had been neither painful nor frightening. Instead, it had been calm and comforting. She leaned slightly closer to Juan, realizing just how much her life had changed since he appeared. At that moment, Juan stirred awake. Smiling, he wrapped both mother and daughter in a protective embrace. The simple gesture filled Rigi's heart with happiness. For perhaps the first time in her life, she felt truly safe. After a refreshing night's sleep, Juan carefully opened his eyes and noticed Dorothy still sleeping peacefully. Moving slowly so he wouldn't wake her, he gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Then he stepped outside. There he found Rigi already busy preparing for the day ahead. Noticing her struggling with a heavy bucket, he immediately took it from her hands. His small smile left her flustered. Then, with surprising ease, he wrung out a heavy towel, displaying a strength that made her stare in amazement. Turning toward her, he spoke softly. "Honey, are you awake? Did you sleep well?" The affectionate nickname instantly turned Rigi's face bright red. Lowering her head, she wondered whether honey was simply a friendly term or something far more personal. Meanwhile, Juan scratched the back of his head awkwardly, worried that he might have embarrassed her. After a moment, Rigi shyly glanced up at him and quietly asked him to keep calling her that. Juan's smile widened. Honey. The gentle way he said it made her cover her face in embarrassment. Finding her reaction adorable, he teased her lightly. Honey, look at me. Just then, Dorothy began rubbing her eyes. Half awake and still caught between dreams and reality, she sat up groggily. A little drool hung at the corner of her mouth, making her look impossibly adorable. After a moment, she flopped right back down, still exhausted. Alarmed, both Juan and Rigi rushed over. To their surprise, Dorothy quickly sat up again and wrapped her arms around their legs. Then her eyes widened dramatically. She had spotted the piles of fresh meat nearby. To Dorothy, it didn't matter whether the meat came from a wolf or a dragon. Meat was meat. And in that moment, it looked absolutely delicious. Seeing how excited the little girl was at the thought of a hearty meal, her parents couldn't help but laugh. Meat. Juan joined in with a cheerful grin. Dorothy didn't hesitate either. She practically lunged toward the bucket while chanting, Meat! Meat! Watching his daughter's boundless excitement, Juan made a silent vow to become a hunter unlike any other. Tightening his grip on the axe, he prepared himself to face whatever creatures the forest might send his way. This time, he walked with confidence. His sharpened axe rested firmly in his hand, giving him a sense of security. However, the deeper he ventured into the dense, untamed forest, the more uneasy he became. A strange feeling settled over him, carrying the weight of a bad omen. Despite the vastness of the woods, the air seemed thin and oppressive, making each breath feel heavier than the last. His eyes swept across the shadows, wondering what kind of monster might appear next. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. Juan immediately turned around, ready to confront a beast. Instead, he saw the silhouette of a man. The stranger wore a heavy cloak that concealed most of his features and walked silently through the forest, seemingly unaware of Juan's presence. When he finally turned his head, an aged face came into view. His weathered features were accompanied by eyes as sharp and cold as a hunter's blade. Juan stood still, wondering who this mysterious man was and what purpose had brought him to such a remote corner of the forest. A short time later, the story shifts back to the hooded man. He stood quietly among the trees, gazing at the bloodstains scattered across the ground. Carefully examining the evidence, he muttered, There are traces of a beast here as well. For such obvious tracks to remain visible, the creature must have been enormous. As he slowly moved forward, he continued piecing together the clues. Even if someone had been helping him, I could have understood it. But he was completely alone. After observing that giant mountain dweller for several days, I've learned one thing. He's a man who barely knows how to handle a blade. His eyes narrowed as he followed the trail deeper into the woods. With every new clue, the situation became even harder to believe. Soon, he discovered more bloodstains along the path. Stopping briefly, he stared at them in disbelief. That giant who knows almost nothing about hunting managed to kill a massive beast? He shook his head. Impossible. Even a skilled hunter would struggle to bring down such a creature alone without proper weapons. I need to confirm this myself. Determined to uncover the truth, he pressed onward. The scene then returns to the moment when the hooded man first appeared before Juan. The two stood facing one another in silence, but the stranger's attention remained fixed on Juan's hand. His sharp gaze carefully examined the scars covering it. Judging by the shape of the wounds, these were undoubtedly wolf bites. But something didn't make sense. Why had the skin healed so completely? If he had truly suffered injuries that severe, infection and fever should have claimed his life long ago. If the bones had been exposed, then the muscles and blood vessels should have been torn apart as well. He shouldn't even be capable of moving normally. Yet here he stood, perfectly healthy. The more the hooded man considered it, the stranger it became. Then a single possibility entered his mind. There's only one explanation. A look of confusion briefly crossed his face. Could this man be a mage? Not just any mage, but an exceptionally rare one. Though puzzled, excitement was already beginning to grow within him. There are mages in this world, he thought, beings that ordinary people may never encounter in their entire lives. If this man truly is a mage, then at last, the opportunity I've been waiting for has arrived. The moment that realization settled in his mind, a chilling smile slowly spread beneath his hood. His eyes gleamed with dark anticipation as he whispered words he never expected to speak again. A chance for revenge. One I believed would never come before my death. Meanwhile, Juan couldn't shake the feeling of unease after meeting the strange old man. Countless thoughts raced through his mind. Who exactly is he? He wondered silently. The old man remained quiet for a moment before finally speaking. His voice sounded calm, but a deep bitterness lingered beneath every word, as though the burdens of countless painful years still weighed heavily upon him. I'm just a stubborn old man now, he began slowly, "but there was a time when I was young and full of vigor." His gaze drifted into the distance as he continued. "If you became a forest keeper responsible for managing a noble's mountain or woodland, you were required to spend a period serving on the battlefield. Those who earned enough military merit could even rise to become retainers of the Lord." His eyes seemed to look far into the past as memories resurfaced. "I left my father behind and traveled from village to village, dreaming of becoming a mountain dweller and an independent hunter." A faint smile appeared on his face. "Eventually, I became the forest keeper of a certain village. It was a mountain blessed with abundance. Game was plentiful, the forests were rich, and life appeared peaceful." Then the smile faded. "The only problem was firewood. Since commoners were permitted to enter the Lord's forest, they often had to travel deep into the mountains to gather it." He let out a quiet laugh. "At the time, I thought that was a blessing. I believed it would help me learn the terrain more thoroughly." His expression darkened. "Never once did I stop to question why the villagers collected firewood only from the shallow areas of the mountain." Silence lingered for a moment before his voice turned colder. "A forest keeper responsible for protecting and managing a lord's woods was required to possess all four limbs when signing the contract." His eyes lowered. "Just before the contract was finalized, I no longer met that requirement." A shadow passed across his face as the memory resurfaced. "I was rejected." His expression grew even darker. "I never could have seen it coming. I never imagined there were goblins living in those mountains." The hatred in the old man's voice could no longer be concealed. "Goblins abduct human women and force them to bear their offspring. Only later did I discover that the village, where women kept vanishing and dying, had become infamous because of it." Nearby stood a goblin settlement. Beneath his cloak, the old man clenched his fists tightly as decades of resentment resurfaced. "After that, I lived a miserable life. Everything was taken from me, and my future was destroyed. Yet I kept living for one reason alone, waiting for the day I could finally take revenge on the goblins who ruined everything I had." Even now, the pain in his eyes had never truly disappeared. "Although I hated the villagers for hiding the truth from me, I remained among them for decades. The only thing that kept me alive was the obsession that one day, somehow, I would make those bastards pay." Then a single thought entered his mind. "This man can do it." The story returns to the present as the hooded old man's attention becomes completely focused on Juan. As he observed him, he carefully analyzed every detail. That enormous body, that monstrous strength. You won't find anyone like him around here. His gaze sharpened. And on top of that, he possesses an unbelievable healing ability. The old man's eyes narrowed beneath the shadow of his hood as darker thoughts formed. Right now, the goblins are hiding deep in the mountains, but once they start running short of women, they'll inevitably attack the village again. His resolve hardened. "Before that happens, I'll turn this man into an extraordinary hunter." A cold determination settled within him as he finalized his plan. "I need to keep the existence of the Goblin Den secret until the contract is signed. Once it's completed, the binding force will take effect, and he won't be able to walk away whenever he pleases." At that moment, Juan slightly bowed his head toward the old man as a gesture of respect. Even while receiving the greeting, however, the hooded man remained cautious. As he observed Juan, he thought to himself, "Even while greeting me, he's keeping his center of gravity shifted backward." A faint smile appeared on Juan's face, but the old man immediately noticed something. He's smiling, yet he hasn't lowered his guard at all. Realizing this, he became even more convinced that Juan was not nearly as simple-minded as he had first appeared. Looking directly at him, the hooded man spoke. "From today onward, I'll teach you everything I know. You'll become an excellent hunter." Hearing those unexpected words, Juan was left slightly confused. He couldn't understand the old man's motives or why he suddenly wanted to train him. Before he could question it further, the scene shifted once more. The following morning arrived. Juan slowly opened his eyes and muttered sleepily, "It feels like I only closed my eyes for a second, and it's already morning." Inside the house, Rhea and Dorothy were grilling meat over the fire. While quietly preparing for the day ahead, Juan got up and headed toward the door. One of the windows stood open. As he glanced through it, he noticed the hooded old man waiting outside. The moment he saw him, Juan's expression became cautious once again. "I didn't invite him inside." He thought quietly to himself. "When I'm not around, I don't want someone becoming comfortable entering a house where only Rhea and Dorothy are staying." Even as he prepared to leave, Juan continued keeping a close eye on the old man from inside the house. Outside, the hooded man stood with a faint smile on his face. Unfortunately, that smile felt incredibly suspicious. Seeing it, Juan couldn't help thinking, "Seriously, that's an awfully suspicious smile." The expression immediately reminded him of something from his previous life. That smile looks exactly like an HR manager during salary negotiations. Even so, Juan could tell the old man was genuinely trying to act politely in his own strange way. As he continued observing him, another thought crossed his mind. Still, it seems like he's trying to learn proper manners. I should put some effort into teaching him. At that moment, Ri called out to him from behind. Turning around, Juan replied calmly, Ri, don't worry, I'll be back soon. As he watched her preparing food for him, his expression softened. She's making me a lunchbox just like a wife would. A gentle warmth filled his heart. She's really doing her best. A faint smile appeared on his face. She's adorable. Nearby, little Dorothy had been quietly watching her mother the entire time. The moment she realized Juan was about to leave, she hurried toward the door as though she wanted to stop him. At the same time, Ri quickly handed Juan the lunchbox. Hurry, you need to go. Then she added nervously, make sure you eat properly. Seeing how sincerely they cared about him filled Juan with a warmth he wasn't used to feeling. As he looked at them, he thought quietly, having a family that worries about me really is something wonderful. Ri continued staring at him with concern before finally speaking. Come back safely. Hearing those words, Juan interpreted them in his own way. That's probably her way of saying she wants me to return safely. Then Ri repeated herself, almost as if she desperately wanted to make sure he understood. Come back safely. This time, Juan answered with a small smile. I will. At that exact moment, Dorothy ran over as well. In her tiny voice, she told her father to return safely too. Looking at his daughter, Juan smiled gently and replied once again, I will. As Juan stood there watching the bright smiles on the faces of his new family, a gentle warmth spread through his heart. Seeing Ri and Dorothy smiling at him so innocently, he couldn't help but think, my suddenly acquired wife and daughter are just too adorable. However, there was no time to linger on those thoughts. For now, he had to follow the old man deeper into the mountains. The hooded elder continued walking ahead without pause while Juan followed closely behind. After traveling for what felt like an endless distance, Juan began growing increasingly suspicious. What exactly is he trying to show me that requires this much walking? He wondered. At last, the old man stopped at a particular spot. He began speaking in his unusual manner, making it difficult to understand his meaning at first. After listening carefully, Juan gradually figured it out. Is he telling me to look at the ground? At the same time, the old man started demonstrating something with his feet, carefully moving across the soil beneath them. Juan observed every movement closely. The moment he noticed the footprints being left behind, his expression shifted slightly. Those footprints are strange. His eyes remained fixed on the old man's feet. Is this some kind of special footwork? Maybe a secret technique? Something like a 1,000-pound step or an earth-shattering stomp? The thought filled him with amazement. Whatever it is, if I want to learn it, I need to watch carefully and copy every movement exactly. Without hesitation, Juan immediately began imitating the footwork. Step by step, he followed the old man's movements as precisely as possible. Meanwhile, the elder continued walking calmly ahead, occasionally glancing back as if silently checking Juan's progress while they ventured deeper into the mountains. Later, Juan realized the old man had actually been teaching him how to understand mountain trails. The lessons were far more detailed than he had expected. The old man would have him touch the bark of different trees, teaching him how every slope and region of the mountain possessed its own unique texture and atmosphere. At other times, he would make Juan stand still and carefully feel the shape of the ground beneath his feet over and over until the terrain became permanently engraved in his memory. The training was repetitive and exhausting, but little by little, Juan began understanding the mountains in a way he never had before. After a long period of training, the two finally stopped to rest. Juan sat down, trying to catch his breath. The old man quietly opened his bag and took something out. The moment Juan saw it, his eyes immediately lit up. I finally get to eat the lunch Ri worked so hard to make. Excited, he quickly opened his bag and pulled out the lunchbox. The delicious aroma instantly reached him. It smells amazing. Just as he was about to open it completely, the old man suddenly spoke with a serious expression. Don't open your lunch here. Juan looked at him in confusion. The old man continued explaining. The scent of a meal prepared by humans is completely different from the natural smell of the mountains. Once that aroma spreads, every wild beast nearby will notice it immediately. Hearing this, Juan quickly closed the lunchbox again. Holding it carefully in both hands, he stared down at it with a bittersweet smile. Rai woke up early this morning and worked hard to make this for me. His expression softened. I really hope this won't be the first and last time I get to eat it. Juan sat quietly, clutching the lunchbox tightly, as emotions welled up inside him. With a helpless expression, he muttered, "I feel like I'm about to cry." Not long afterward, the old man led Juan to his residence deep within the mountains. The place was simple, isolated, and blended perfectly into the surrounding wilderness. Juan looked around the old wooden house with curiosity. "So this is where you live?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked inside and returned a few moments later carrying several weapons. The moment Juan's eyes landed on one particular bow, his expression changed. "Wait, that bow looks strange." Confusion filled his mind. "The bows I know don't look anything like that. How are you even supposed to shoot an arrow with a bow shaped that way?" The design appeared unusual and far more intimidating than any ordinary bow he had ever seen. Before he could ask any questions, the old man handed him one of the bows and calmly said, "Take this bow and follow me." The instant Juan grabbed it, his arms sank slightly under its weight. His eyes widened in surprise. "Can I really use this thing?" He stared at the massive weapon. It looks like it would take an absurd amount of strength just to draw the string. Meanwhile, the old man had already prepared his own bow with complete ease. Juan carefully observed every movement. His motions aren't rough at all. Amazement filled his eyes. It's almost as if time has stopped, even while he's drawing such a huge bow. There was no wasted movement in the old man's actions. Everything flowed naturally and effortlessly, as though the bow were simply an extension of his body. Then, in the next instant, he released the arrow. The projectile shot forward with incredible speed and struck the exact center of the target without deviating even slightly. Juan watched in complete silence. His eyes were filled with shock and admiration. After witnessing such a flawless shot, he took a deep breath and prepared himself. Gripping the bow tightly, he attempted to imitate the old man's stance. As he tried to aim, the old man stepped beside him and began correcting his posture and technique. Little by little, Juan adjusted his form. Even while standing so close, the old man's body remained perfectly calm and steady. Not even his hands trembled. How is he not shaking at all? Juan thought in disbelief, while struggling just to keep the heavy bow stable. Tightening his grip, he focused completely. "I need to concentrate." His determination hardened. "The new words I've learned today. The movements a hunter must master. I have to study and train harder until all of this becomes natural." His thoughts turned toward the people waiting for him at home. "I want to become a man who can properly provide for my wife and daughter." As those thoughts filled his mind, his determination only grew stronger. Every lesson the old man taught Juan now felt important, not only for his own survival but also for the future of the family waiting for him at home. The scene then shifted back to the small house, where Ree and Dorothy were spending time together near the warmth of the fireplace. Dorothy happily hummed to herself while enjoying both the food and the cozy atmosphere. The sky is bright blue, the snow is pure white, Rye's hair is all shiny, Juan's hair is black, and the meat feels like it's helping me grow while I sit here by the fireplace. She sang cheerfully in her innocent little voice. After finishing her meal, Dorothy slowly stood up while holding her stomach. "I'm so full," she said happily. "It feels like the meat is getting bigger inside my tummy." Nearby, Ree quietly laughed at Dorothy's strange but adorable description. Dorothy noticed the smile immediately. She's been smiling a lot more ever since Juan arrived, Dorothy thought. Before that, we hardly smiled at all. As she watched Ree laugh so naturally, a warm feeling spread through her chest. Just hearing her laugh makes me feel warm inside, like I'm sitting right next to the fireplace. Then another thought crossed her mind. I hope the food in my stomach digests quickly so I can eat even more. However, after those happy thoughts, her expression gradually became more serious. A small feeling of uncertainty crept into her heart as she began thinking about Juan. Who exactly is Juan? Ree had told her that Juan was her husband. If Juan is Ree's husband, then what is he to me? Her innocent curiosity slowly transformed into anxiety. Juan and Ree aren't really my father and mother, are they? The warmth she had been feeling moments earlier slowly faded away as fear quietly entered her mind. Are they going to leave me behind too, just like my father did? Her thoughts grew darker. Since Juan is Ree's husband, does that mean he'll only take Ree with him? Dorothy lowered her gaze as those painful worries filled her small heart, even while the fire continued burning warmly in front of her. What will happen to me? The uneasy question echoed endlessly inside her mind. Suddenly, Dorothy awoke from sleep. Her eyes slowly opened as she looked around the quiet room in confusion. Where did everyone go? She whispered softly. The moment she sat up, fragments of an old memory resurfaced like a nightmare she could never escape. A harsh voice echoed in her mind. Useless girl. If you'd been born a boy, at least you could have worked, but all you do is eat. It was one of the painful memories buried deep inside her heart, a memory that continued to haunt her. Dorothy immediately shook her head and anxiously looked toward the food. The meat. After confirming it was still there, she sighed in relief. The meat is safe. But another worry immediately appeared. Then where did Ree go? At that exact moment, loud shouting erupted from outside the house. Don't you dare lie to me. The terrifying voice caused Dorothy to freeze. Trembling, she carefully peeked outside. The moment she saw the men standing there, her face turned pale. I've seen those men before. Fear gripped her heart. They're the ones who always came to threaten and beat my father. Painful memories flooded back one after another. Whenever those men left, her father would take his anger out on her and her foster mother instead. He would beat them in place of the men he feared. Dorothy's body trembled as she looked toward Ree. Is she going to be okay? Fear filled her thoughts. What if they beat her half to death too, just like they did to my foster mother? Outside the house, a yellow-haired man had grabbed Ree by the hair and was aggressively questioning her. Answer me, what's that smell? He shouted angrily. You stole our meat, didn't you? Despite the pain, Ree desperately shook her head. No, I didn't steal anything. My husband hunted it himself. The yellow-haired man immediately scoffed. What kind of nonsense is that? Do you think hunting is something anyone can do? At that moment, a red-haired man standing nearby spoke coldly. We should search the house. Let's see what she's hiding. Ree panicked the moment she heard those words. I told you it's not what you think. My husband really hunted that meat. I'm telling the truth. Please believe me. She pleaded desperately. The three men paid no attention to her words. They roughly threw her onto the ground before forcing their way into the house. The moment they entered, their eyes immediately landed on the massive wolf hide Juan had brought back. It's huge. The yellow-haired man stared in shock. A greedy look quickly appeared on his face. We can sell this for a fortune. We've hit the jackpot. He immediately turned to the others. Search everything. Don't leave a single corner unchecked. One of the men quickly looked around before shouting, Hey, there's meat over here. Meanwhile, Dorothy had been hiding beneath a bed the entire time. Her small body trembled uncontrollably as she tried not to make a sound while the men searched the house. Then, one of them suddenly muttered in disbelief. Did that bastard actually hunt a wolf? At that exact moment, Ree rushed inside and desperately shouted, No, don't touch that. It belongs to us. The yellow-haired man looked at her and sneered. Look at this bitch. He laughed mockingly. A little while ago, she wouldn't have dared talk back to us. Another man shoved her roughly. Now that she's got herself a husband, she's suddenly grown some teeth. Ree crashed onto the floor. Trembling, she slowly pushed herself back up. As she lifted her head, her eyes landed beneath the bed where Dorothy was hiding. Fear immediately flashed across her face. If those men discovered Dorothy, she couldn't even imagine what they might do. Without hesitation, Ree pretended she hadn't seen anything. Beneath the bed, Dorothy covered her mouth as terror overwhelmed her. I was hated because I was a bad child who always hid by herself. Her thoughts spiraled with fear. What should I do? Too frightened to move, she remained completely still. Meanwhile, the yellow-haired man continued mocking Ree. Look at her face. Does she think life is worth living now just because she's got a different husband? Another man chuckled. What if the mountain guardian finds out? The first man snorted. Finds out what? The yellow-haired man shrugged carelessly. He doesn't even understand our language anyway. As long as none of us say anything, we'll be fine. The others continued talking among themselves without the slightest concern. It'll be a problem if we get caught. Mountain guardians aren't easy to replace. It would be troublesome if that guy decided to leave. Then the yellow-haired man grabbed Ree by the arm and violently dragged her toward the door. Then we'll just take this to the forest. I'll bring her along and you two grab the rest of the stuff. Ree desperately struggled to free herself, but before she could protest, the yellow-haired man shot her a cold glare. You know what'll happen if you tell your husband, don't you? His voice turned threatening. We'll come in the middle of the night and burn this cabin down with everything inside it. After delivering the threat, the group finally left the house, dragging Ree away with them. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Slowly, Dorothy crawled out from beneath the bed. Her entire body trembled as tears filled her eyes. Terrifying thoughts raced through her mind. Ree was dragged away. Fear tightened around her chest. Something bad is definitely going to happen to her. Her breathing became uneven. What if she never comes back? Dorothy tried to cry out, but the moment a sound nearly escaped her lips, she quickly covered her mouth with both hands, terrified that the men might still hear her. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she curled up into a small ball. Where are you, Juan? She whispered between sobs. Please come back quickly." Not long afterward, Dorothy completely broke down and began crying uncontrollably. The scene then shifted back to Juan. As he walked home, he thought to himself, today felt unusually long. His face showed clear signs of exhaustion. Before he could continue his thoughts, the old man suddenly called out to him. Juan stopped and respectfully bowed his head. "Thank you for today," the old man said sincerely. But at that exact moment, Juan heard a faint sound in the distance. The instant it reached his ears, his expression changed completely. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Dorothy crying. A cold feeling shot through his chest. Without hesitation, he rushed forward. Dorothy would never cry like that. His heartbeat quickened. Did something happen at home? The thought repeated endlessly in his mind. What if something happened to Ree or Dorothy? Driven by panic, Juan sprinted forward at terrifying speed. The moment he arrived, he acted without hesitation. His first move was a powerful punch straight into the face of the red-haired man. The impact instantly knocked him unconscious. The others froze in shock. Without slowing down, Juan immediately charged at another man wearing a wolf hide. A single knee strike dropped him to the ground. Then his eyes locked onto the yellow-haired man. Juan grabbed him tightly around the waist and violently slammed him onto the ground. Before the man could react, Juan began raining down punches. Every strike carried terrifying force as his anger exploded uncontrollably. Dark thoughts filled his mind. Human nature can be disgusting. His fury continued to build. Once people decide you're beneath them, they think they can do whatever they want. After several moments, Juan slowly rose to his feet. An overwhelming aura radiated from him. The pressure was so intense that everyone present could feel it. His eyes burned with fury. He wanted to engrave fear into these men's minds. If they ever tried something like this again, the consequences would be far worse. With that intention, Juan began walking toward the yellow-haired man once more. Suddenly, a noise came from behind him. The moment Juan turned his head, the yellow-haired man seized the opportunity and attacked with a weapon. But Juan reacted instantly. He caught the man before the strike could land. This time, however, it was obvious that Juan had no intention of showing mercy. The rage within him had reached an entirely different level. The terrifying pressure surrounding him grew even heavier as he held the man firmly in place. The situation was on the verge of spiraling completely out of control. Then the old man suddenly arrived and shouted, "I'm telling you to calm down." His voice rang out sharply. "Can't you see how frightened your daughter is?" Hearing those words, Juan immediately turned toward the house. Standing near the doorway was Dorothy. She was still crying uncontrollably. The moment Juan saw her trembling figure, all the rage inside him vanished. The overwhelming pressure surrounding him disappeared. His expression gradually softened. Nearby, Ree watched everything in silence. Her heart was still racing. He always seemed so gentle, she thought. It was almost as if he didn't know how to get angry. Her eyes drifted toward the men lying unconscious on the ground. But it turns out he can become terrifying when he's truly furious. For a brief moment, she remembered her late husband. While he was beating those men, he reminded me of him. A wave of fear passed through her. I wondered if I might end up beaten too, just like those men. The thought made her body tremble. Yet the moment she looked into Juan's eyes again, that fear disappeared entirely. Those weren't the eyes of someone trying to intimidate me. What she saw was something completely different. They were the eyes of a man desperately trying to protect the people he cared about. He looks worried that I'm afraid of him, she realized quietly. Juan slowly approached her and softly called her name. At the same time, Ree lowered her gaze. Countless emotions swirled within her heart. Why would the feelings of someone as worthless as me matter so much to him? Looking down at her trembling hands, she continued thinking silently. There's nothing left for me to be afraid of anymore, so why am I trembling like this? Ree's chest tightened painfully as she looked at Juan's face. He's misunderstanding. He thinks I'm afraid of him. A wave of sadness washed over her. Husband, please don't look so hurt. She wanted to tell him clearly that she wasn't afraid of him at all. The words themselves would have been simple enough to say. If I could speak his language, I could easily tell him that I'm not afraid of him. Unfortunately, they couldn't understand each other's words. Slowly, Ree reached out her hand and softly called Juan's name. Then she gently placed her hand over his. The warmth she felt instantly spread throughout her entire body. At the same time, all of her fear quietly melted away. For the first time in a very long while, she felt completely safe. It was as if nothing bad could ever happen to her as long as she stayed beside this person. Tears gathered in her eyes. Looking at Juan, she spoke with a trembling voice filled with emotion and gratitude. Afterward, Juan quietly looked down at Ree, who was still holding his hand tightly. In a gentle voice, he softly called her name, Rai. At that moment, Ri's emotions finally overflowed. Unable to control them any longer, she suddenly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Juan looked slightly surprised. Then he gently returned the embrace and softly said, "Thank you." Those words only made Ri even more confused. If anyone should be grateful, it's me, she thought. Not far away, Dorothy had been silently watching everything unfold. Unlike the emotional atmosphere between Juan and Ri, however, Dorothy looked terrified. Her face had gone pale, and her body trembled slightly, as if she were still trapped inside a nightmare. Ri soon noticed her standing there and immediately pointed toward her. Dorothy. The moment she saw Dorothy's condition, Ri hurried toward her without hesitation. Meanwhile, Juan remained outside. He had no intention of interfering and felt it was better to give the two of them some space. As soon as Ri reached Dorothy, she looked at her with concern. "Dorothy, are you all right?" But the closer she got, the more obvious it became that Dorothy was shaking uncontrollably. Dorothy herself couldn't calm down. Countless frightening thoughts continued repeating inside her mind. I was the one who called for help. She remembered Juan's enormous fists swinging through the air. The sight had terrified her. The horrifying images refused to leave her thoughts. Again and again, she remembered the swollen faces of her stepmother and Ri after they had been beaten. Their faces had been covered with painful bruises of red, blue, and yellow. The more she remembered those images, the stronger her fear became. Soon, Dorothy couldn't stop imagining that one day her own face might look exactly the same. That thought alone left her feeling helpless. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. Even as she cried, another painful memory surfaced. A harsh voice echoed in her mind. "You mustn't cry. If you cry, you'll only get beaten more." Those cruel words had been carved so deeply into her heart that even now she was afraid to show weakness. Trying desperately to control herself, Dorothy spoke through her tears. She felt she needed to apologize to Ri immediately. She believed she had done something wrong and needed to admit it before it was too late. Fearfully, she confessed what had been troubling her. She was terrified that Ri might begin treating her like a ghost, just as her stepmother once had. With trembling hands, Dorothy slowly reached out toward Ri and spoke in a weak voice. "I'm sorry for hiding instead of helping you." Tears continued streaming down her face. "Please don't leave me alone. It was my fault." The guilt she had carried for so long finally burst out all at once. She truly believed she had abandoned Ri when she needed help most. More than anything else, she feared being left behind again. The moment Ri heard those words, she immediately pulled Dorothy into a warm embrace. Without the slightest hesitation, she hugged her tightly. "Dorothy, what are you talking about?" Her voice was gentle and reassuring. "When our eyes met earlier, I only pretended not to notice you because I was afraid those men would find you." Her words were filled with warmth and genuine concern. She wanted Dorothy to understand that none of this was her fault. Ri continued comforting her. "You have absolutely nothing to feel guilty about, Dorothy. Nothing at all." Hearing those words, Dorothy slowly looked up through tear-filled eyes. "Really?" The question sounded hesitant, almost as if kindness itself was unfamiliar to her. Ri smiled warmly and gently replied, "You were scared, weren't you?" Then she softly brushed away Dorothy's tears. "But everything is all right now." Her smile widened slightly. "Because Papa is here." The moment Dorothy heard that word, confusion immediately appeared on her face. "Papa." She repeated it in disbelief. "But my dad died." To Dorothy, the idea didn't make any sense. Her real father was gone. Hearing someone suddenly refer to another person as her father left her completely confused. Rai gently asked, "Dorothy, don't you know who Juan is?" Dorothy repeated the name quietly before answering. "Juan, Ri's husband. I know that." Ri nodded with a smile. "That's right. Juan is my husband." Then she continued gently. "And because he's my husband, that makes him Dorothy's papa too." Dorothy's eyes widened. "Papa." This time, she whispered the word much more softly, as though she were trying to understand its meaning. Seeing her reaction, Ri smiled warmly and continued explaining in a gentle voice. "I'm Dorothy's stepmother, right?" Dorothy slowly nodded. Seeing her response, Ri smiled warmly. "Then, since Dorothy is my daughter, Juan is Dorothy's papa too." Dorothy could hardly believe what she was hearing. Slowly, she turned her head and looked outside at Juan standing in the distance. Staring at him blankly, she whispered, "He is my father?" Rai answered without hesitation. "Yes." Then she continued gently, "But Juan is different from your old father. He's not someone who hurts us or beats us." A warm smile appeared on her face. "He's someone who protects us." Her words carried a warmth Dorothy had never experienced before. For perhaps the first time in her life, the word father didn't sound frightening. Dorothy looked back at Juan, still trying to make sense of everything. Finally, with innocent confusion in her trembling voice, she asked, "So, Juan beat those scary men because he's Dorothy's papa?" She paused. "Because I asked him for help?" She quietly repeated those thoughts to herself, still unable to believe it. After a moment, she turned her gaze toward the window again. Outside, Juan was still standing there. A strange warmth slowly filled her chest, a feeling she had never truly experienced before. Almost unconsciously, she began repeating a single word. "Papa." Then again, "Papa." And again, "Papa." Her small voice grew increasingly excited. Countless thoughts overflowed inside her mind. "My papa has a huge face, huge hands, huge feet, and a huge body." A smile spread across her face. "And he's incredibly strong." The excitement in her heart continued growing. "He protects both me and Ree." Because she was still inside the house, Juan couldn't hear her calling him. Unable to contain her emotions any longer, Dorothy suddenly ran outside toward him. As she rushed forward, more thoughts filled her mind. "He doesn't hit me. He holds me close when we sleep. He smiles at me. He gives me meat." A wave of happiness washed over her. "And he even gave me my name." To Dorothy, those simple acts of kindness were more valuable than anything else in the world. Her heart trembled with joy. "The person who gave me my name is my papa." The thought felt almost unbelievable. How wonderful. Still calling out, "Papa, Papa." Dorothy ran closer and closer until she finally reached him. At that moment, Juan turned around. The instant he saw Dorothy's sparkling eyes and heard her excited voice, his entire expression softened. Without hesitation, he scooped her into his arms and lifted her high into the air. Even though he couldn't fully understand the words she was saying, somehow he understood the feelings behind them. Quietly, he thought to himself, "Dorothy keeps saying words I don't understand." A small smile appeared on his face. "They're definitely unfamiliar words, but somehow I feel like I know what they mean." Holding her carefully, Juan gently patted her head. After a few moments, however, his expression changed slightly. "Huh?" He blinked. "What's that smell?" A second later, realization struck. Dorothy peed herself. Even after figuring it out, Juan couldn't help smiling helplessly. Dorothy looked so happy and innocent that he almost felt guilty for noticing it. Still, he immediately reminded himself, "I need to change her clothes before she catches a cold." At that moment, Ree finally came running outside. As soon as she arrived, Juan naturally pulled her into the embrace as well. Soon, he was holding both Dorothy and Ree in his large arms. For the first time, the scene truly felt like a real family. However, while enjoying the moment, Dorothy suddenly noticed something behind them. Her eyes widened. The meat. Instantly, her face lit up with excitement. Without wasting a second, she dashed away so quickly that both Juan and Ree were left confused. They watched in surprise as she ran toward the pile of unconscious men and stopped beside a nearby basket. Despite being such a small child, Dorothy immediately tried lifting the heavy basket with all her strength. Naturally, it was far too heavy for her. At first, it didn't move at all. Even so, Dorothy stubbornly refused to give up. Gritting her teeth, she poured every ounce of strength she had into lifting it. Seeing her struggle so seriously, Juan and Ree hurried over to help. Before they could reach her, however, Dorothy somehow managed to raise the basket, little by little on her own. Juan stared in complete disbelief. Deep inside, he could only think, "Incredible." Then another thought followed. Her obsession with meat is absolutely terrifying. Watching her continue fighting against the heavy basket, Juan finally stepped forward to help. The moment Dorothy sensed him behind her, she turned around. As soon as she saw her father, her eyes sparkled once more. Juan effortlessly grabbed the basket and helped lift it. Seeing Dorothy look at him with such admiration over something as simple as carrying a container of meat made him feel strangely amused. Quietly, he thought to himself, to get a look like that from a child over a single basket of meat. A small smile formed on his face. Becoming a hero is surprisingly easy. At that moment, Ree called out from nearby, "Bring the meat inside, and take Dorothy in too. It's dangerous out here." Hearing her words, Juan calmly nodded. Soon afterward, the three of them headed back into the house together, carrying both Dorothy and the precious basket of meat with them. The atmosphere inside the house felt much warmer and safer than the terrifying chaos that had unfolded outside. After making sure everything was settled indoors, Juan eventually stepped back outside alone. The moment he crossed the doorway, the warmth in his expression vanished completely. In its place burned a deep and intense anger. He still had no intention of forgiving the three men lying unconscious on the ground. Deep down, he wanted to eliminate them completely, so they would never be able to threaten his family again. However, before he could act on those violent thoughts, the old man stepped forward and firmly stopped him. "You must not beat or kill people anymore." Hearing those words, Juan turned toward him and replied coldly, "You're telling me not to kill them." Even as he spoke, his thoughts continued racing. "That's right. If I kill them, it could become a problem." Another realization followed immediately. I could be arrested, or worse, become a slave again. That thought alone forced him to calm down slightly. Things were no longer the same as before. He could no longer make decisions based only on himself. He now had people depending on him. Juan glared at the defeated men lying before him and muttered through clenched teeth, "You bastards." Yet his thoughts were even darker than his words. "I'm not alone anymore." His eyes narrowed. "But I'll remember every one of your faces." The anger inside him remained as strong as ever. "If our paths cross again, you'll face a fate far worse than death." His killing intent had not disappeared. He was simply forcing himself to suppress it for the time being. After regaining some control over his emotions, Juan looked around and noticed the supplies scattered across the ground. A practical thought crossed his mind. I should at least take these. The mountains demanded self-sufficiency. Useful resources were too valuable to waste. Throwing away supplies would only make survival more difficult in the future. At that moment, Juan glanced back through the open doorway. Inside, he could see Rhea and Dorothy together. Both of them looked safe, happy, and at peace. The sight immediately softened his expression. For a brief moment, all the anger raging inside him quietly settled. Without saying another word, he gathered the remaining supplies from outside and carried them back into the house. As he walked toward the room where his wife and daughter were waiting for him, a powerful thought echoed through his heart. Losing a family once was more than enough. His eyes hardened with determination. No matter what happens. He tightened his grip on the supplies he was carrying. I will protect this family. Juhan gently brushed his fingers through Riggy's hair while looking at her injuries with a worried expression. Deep inside, he couldn't stop thinking that if he had known healing magic, he could have healed all of her wounds instantly. The thought made him feel frustrated with himself. Noticing his concern, Riggy softly placed her hand against his cheek and assured him that she was all right. Then, using both hands, she gently pulled the corners of his lips into a smile. Juhan looked confused by her sudden action, but at the same time, he felt a little happier. Without any warning, Juhan suddenly lifted Riggy into his arms. Startled, she stared at him in confusion. Feeling embarrassed, Juhan quickly explained that the floor was too cold for her to sit on. However, as he looked at her more carefully, something immediately caught his attention. The injury marks on Riggy's face had completely vanished. Juhan's eyes widened in disbelief. He began to wonder if the magic training he had practiced earlier was finally producing results. As the realization settled in, excitement spread across his face. Finally, I can use healing magic. Meanwhile, Riggy simply stared at him, completely puzzled about why he had suddenly become so happy. The scene then shifted to the following day at another location. Has this bird-brained idiot completely lost his mind? An angry woman shouted as she kicked a nearby rooster. He doesn't even recognize his own master and keeps sticking his beak into everything. Standing beside her, a man calmly replied, Does giving some fabric to the mountain guardian really bother you that much? The woman immediately turned toward him in frustration. Even so, there was no reason to give him fabric too. I saved that fabric for 10 whole years. I know, the man answered, but it couldn't be helped. He looked like someone experienced in fighting. After a short pause, his expression became serious. If more people get injured or die, this year's harvest will be completely ruined. Foolish woman, you're only focused on what's right in front of you. You fail to see the bigger picture. The woman crossed her arms and glared at him. And just how important is this so-called bigger picture that you're willing to give away my precious fabric so easily? The village chief slowly smiled. I saw it clearly yesterday. Not only did he have beast bite wounds that weren't there when he first arrived, but those wounds were healing at an unbelievable speed. At that moment, everything finally made sense to him. What Gus said must be true. The Mountain Guardian is a mage, and not just any mage, but a healing mage. A greedy smile slowly spread across his face. I need to handle him very carefully. Even nobles would desperately want a healing mage this powerful. His grin widened even further. And if the royal family learns about him, I could make a fortune from this. The mere thought filled him with excitement. If everything goes according to plan, I won't have to remain some ordinary village chief anymore. Looking around cautiously, he lowered his voice. Right now, nobody here realizes that a healing mage is living among us. These villagers are too ignorant to notice something like that. But if rumors begin to spread, nobles or guilds will take him away before I can profit from it. After thinking for a moment, he continued, the only person I can trust with this is old Gus. While Gus keeps an eye on the mountain guardian, I'll search for nobles willing to pay a fortune for a healing mage. Then he turned toward his wife. Hey, try getting along with the mountain guardian's wife. According to Gus, that mountain guardian learned hunting incredibly fast. He's sharp too. His expression turned cautious. If we're not careful, he might discover that we've been skimming the Lord's supplies and report us. Then, wearing a sly grin, he added, besides, I've heard he's extremely attached to his new wife. The village chief leaned in closer before continuing. If you become friends with his wife, we might be able to buy rabbit pelts from them much cheaper. His wife nodded slowly. Fine. Besides, there aren't many women around here for me to spend time with anyway. With that, she turned around and walked away. After she left, the village chief's expression became thoughtful. We should return some of the things we took from the mountain guardian's cabin. He stared silently into the fire for a moment before speaking again. Compared to the others we've brought here before, he's on an entirely different level. His tone became serious. If we don't deal with this carefully now, it could turn into a huge problem later. As he tossed another log into the flames, he let out a deep sigh. It's unfortunate, but it can't be helped. The crackling sound of the fire filled the room as he quietly muttered, you have to sacrifice some flesh to get the bones. A few days later, the scene shifted back to Juhan's cabin. Warm morning sunlight passed through the wooden walls as Juhan prepared for another day. While getting ready, his eyes naturally wandered toward Riggy. A faint smile appeared on his face. Riggy seems especially happy today. The village chief must have thought that one bolt of fabric wasn't enough because he had sent even more items that morning. Juhan watched Riggy happily sorting through the gifts with sparkling eyes. A helpless smile spread across his face. She hadn't even looked this happy when the bruises on her face disappeared right before her eyes. Watching her become excited over such simple things made him admire her even more. Whenever I look at Riggy, I feel like she's teaching me how to appreciate the little things in life. His eyes softened warmly. And that's exactly why I love her. A gentle smile appeared across his face. A woman like her means everything to me. After finishing his preparations, June turned toward Riggy. I'm heading out now. As usual, Riggy adorably repeated his words back to him. The two exchanged a few more affectionate words, completely lost in their own lovey-dovey world. Eventually, Juhan stepped outside. Standing at the doorway, Riggy waved goodbye as he walked away. Some time later, Juhan arrived at old Gus's house. Gus had told him earlier that they would be hunting rabbits today. However, as Juhan thought about it, a conflicted expression appeared on his face. Will we actually be able to catch a rabbit? More importantly, will I really be able to kill one? The problem wasn't hunting itself. The real issue was Dorothy. That rabbit-like girl was always asking for meat, and somehow, every time Juhan imagined a rabbit, Dorothy's face instantly appeared in his mind. Trying to shake away the thought, he took a deep breath. I'm a hunter. I can't afford to be this soft-hearted. But no matter how much he tried, the image refused to disappear. Whenever he pictured a rabbit, all he could see was his rabbit-like wife. I can't stop thinking about my rabbit-like wife. Covering his face with his hands, he groaned. So how am I supposed to kill one? After calming his thoughts as much as possible, Juhan followed the trail deeper into the forest. The towering trees cast long shadows across the ground as he moved forward. If we really do catch one, he sighed, I just hope it's ugly. At that moment, something suddenly moved within a thick patch of bushes deep in the forest. Two crimson-red eyes slowly emerged from the darkness. Something was watching them. Juan stepped out of the cabin and inhaled a deep breath of fresh air. The morning was calm and quiet, and for the first time that day, he felt as though he finally had a moment to relax. I've already carried the water and chopped all the firewood, he murmured to himself, and I still have some time left. He stretched his arms overhead and glanced up at the sky. After thinking for a moment, an idea suddenly came to him. Maybe I should practice magic. Ever since arriving in this unfamiliar world, using healing magic had become surprisingly natural. Small cuts, bruises, and minor injuries could be healed without much effort. However, there was still one type of magic he couldn't seem to master. Fire magic. Healing injuries is easy now, he said quietly, but I still can't create even the smallest flame. His mind immediately drifted back to the battle with the wolf. During that life-threatening encounter, he had somehow managed to summon fire. So why had it worked then? Juan folded his arms and thought carefully. Was it because I was in danger? Did I only succeed because I was desperate? The theory seemed plausible. Taking a slow breath, He closed his eyes and focused on the energy flowing through his body. He tried to recreate the feeling he had experienced during the fight. Gradually, he raised his hand. Firestorm. Nothing happened. The surroundings remained completely still. Not even the faintest spark appeared. Juan stared at his empty palm and sighed. "I'm not disappointed," he said with a shrug. "I wasn't expecting much anyway." Even so, he couldn't completely hide his frustration. If he could properly use fire magic, Dorothy would absolutely love it. Healing magic wasn't flashy. It didn't shine brightly. It didn't produce explosions, sparks, or dramatic effects. To Dorothy, healing magic was simply boring. "I really wanted to show her some fire magic," he admitted. "What a shame." Then suddenly, crack. A tiny spark appeared above his palm. Juan's eyes widened. "Huh?" The spark flickered weakly before growing into a small flame. He immediately focused on it. So it worked. A smile slowly spread across his face. He had finally succeeded. Unfortunately, the flame was incredibly small. It was barely larger than the flame of an ordinary lighter. Juan stared at it for several seconds. "This is a little disappointing." The tiny fire danced weakly above his hand. "I finally managed to create fire, and it's this small." Before he could complain any further, the cabin door slowly creaked open. Dorothy stepped outside, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She looked as though she had just woken up from a nap. At first, she didn't notice anything unusual, but as her vision cleared, she suddenly froze. Her mouth fell open. Dad's hand is on fire. Her drowsiness vanished instantly. She looked completely awake now. Dad is using fire magic. She excitedly pointed at Juan's hand. Juan laughed awkwardly. "Dorothy, you're standing a little too close." The little girl completely ignored him. Her eyes shone even brighter than the flame itself. "I have to tell Mom." Without wasting another second, she spun around and ran toward the cabin. "Mom, Dad is using fire magic." Juan couldn't help smiling. Compared to his own reaction, Dorothy seemed far more amazed by the tiny flame. The reflection of the fire danced in her eyes as she continued staring at it in fascination. A few moments later, Rhea stepped outside. At first, she looked confused. Then she noticed the flame. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Juan?" She stared at his hand. "There's fire coming from your hand." "Dad is using fire magic," Dorothy proudly announced once again. Rhea looked genuinely astonished. Juan glanced at both of them. Rhea looked genuinely impressed, while Dorothy was practically bursting with excitement. It seemed they both had a special fondness for fire magic. "I guess I'll have to get better at this," Juan thought. It would certainly take time, but he couldn't stop smiling. Not long ago, he hadn't been able to use fire magic at all. Now, even though the flame was tiny, it was proof that he was making progress. "At the very least," he said, "I can probably use it to light campfires." Suddenly, Rhea seemed to remember something. "Oh." Without saying another word, she turned around and hurried back into the cabin. Dorothy blinked in confusion before quickly running after her. "Mom, wait." Juan watched them disappear inside. Already done watching? Just moments ago, they had been completely fascinated by the flame. Now they were both gone. Standing by himself, Juan looked down at the small fire hovering above his hand. "I worked hard to make this." Then another thought crossed his mind. "How do I turn it off?" He stared at the flame. It continued burning peacefully. Juan waved his hand. Nothing happened. He shook his arm. Still nothing. The flame remained exactly where it was. This is a problem. He tried several more methods, but none of them worked. Eventually, he gave up. Whatever, it'll probably go out on its own. The moment he finished speaking, poof, the flame vanished. Juan blinked. Seriously? A few seconds passed before he let out a sigh. The magic in this world is really strange. Shaking his head, he headed back toward the cabin. As he approached the entrance, he noticed Dorothy standing beside a bucket. It was the bucket containing the last of their meat. "Dorothy." The little girl peered inside with a miserable expression. "There's barely any meat left." She sounded genuinely heartbroken. Rhea couldn't help laughing. Juan glanced into the bucket. The remaining amount of meat was indeed very small. No wonder Dorothy looked so depressed. The girl loved meat more than almost anything else. Seeing her reaction, Juan smiled. "Don't worry." Dorothy immediately looked up. "Dad will definitely bring home some rabbit meat today." At that moment, a familiar voice called out, "Juan." Juan turned around. An elderly man was standing nearby. "Are you ready?" The moment he saw him, Juan recognized him immediately. "Old Gus, finally. You're here." He picked up his bag and gathered his weapons. Looks like it's time to go. Dad? Dorothy ran over to him. Have a safe trip. Juan smiled and gently patted her head. Dorothy is such a good girl. Be careful, Juan, Raya said. You too, Juan replied. Then he leaned forward and kissed Rhea. Dorothy watched closely. A few moments later, she raised her hand. Dad, me too? Juan laughed softly. Don't worry. He crouched down and smiled. You get one too. Then he kissed Dorothy on the cheek. The little girl instantly beamed. Mission accomplished. As Juan stood up, he suddenly sniffed the air. Then he looked at Dorothy suspiciously. Why do you smell like meat? Dorothy froze. Did you sneak some again? The little girl nodded proudly. Yes. Rhea burst out laughing. Juan could only shake his head. Soon afterward, he and Gus set off toward the mountains. The trip quickly turned into a lesson. Gus constantly shared useful knowledge along the way. Sometimes he asked questions. Could that tree be used as firewood? Other times, he pointed out tracks and signs left behind by animals. At one point, he even showed Juan a pile of rabbit droppings. This tells us rabbits passed through here recently. Juan listened attentively. There was still so much he didn't know. Everything about hunting was completely new to him. Then, all of a sudden, Gus raised a hand. Stop. Juan immediately halted. Gus pointed ahead. Look over there. Juan followed his finger. A rabbit stood in the distance. At least, it looked like a rabbit. A rabbit? Juan frowned. The rabbits he remembered from Earth looked nothing like this creature. This one was much larger. In fact, it looked more like a kangaroo. Is this because I got isekai'd? He wondered. He stared at the animal. That thing looks more like a kangaroo than a rabbit. The creature hopped forward energetically. Seeing it, Gus nodded. This is perfect. For what? Your first hunt. Juan looked at the rabbit again. It doesn't look dangerous. Exactly, Gus replied. Compared to the beasts that attacked you before, this creature is completely defenseless. A nostalgic smile appeared on the old hunter's face. I still remember my first hunt. Then his expression grew serious once more. Use your bow. Juan slowly prepared himself. As he did, he couldn't help admiring Gus. The old hunter had only been teaching him for a short time, yet he was learning something new every day. This is your hunt, Gus said. I'm only here to teach you the harsh reality of hunting. Then he pointed at the rabbit. You'll never forget this day. He paused. Aim for its leg first. Juan frowned immediately. The leg? That made no sense to him. A shot to the leg wouldn't kill the rabbit. It would only make it suffer. Gus nodded. Exactly. Juan remained silent. First, you shoot a stationary target, Gus explained. Then you shoot a target struggling in pain. His tone remained calm. This is training. Juan didn't like hearing that. Still, he listened. The mountain belongs to no one. Gus continued as he looked toward the distant peaks. Today, luck may be on your side. Then he glanced at the rabbit. Tomorrow, it may be on the animal's side. Finally, he looked directly into Juan's eyes. If you want to make it home alive, never forget today. Juan tightened his grip on the bow. He still didn't fully understand everything. He knew almost nothing about hunting. He knew almost nothing about the mountains. But he understood one thing. Gus wasn't teaching him how to kill. He was teaching him how to survive. At that moment, the rabbit noticed him. Its ears twitched. Juan slowly raised his bow. For some reason, the scene reminded him of his first day in this world. The cage. The fear. The helplessness. The realization that human beings could imprison other human beings. The memory flashed through his mind before fading away. Then he focused on the present once more. I know nothing about these mountains. I know nothing about hunting. But Gus is trying to teach me how to stay alive. Juan took a deep breath. He pulled back the bowstring. The rabbit remained completely unaware of the danger approaching. Everything seemed to slow down. The wind stopped. The leaves became motionless. Even the sounds of the forest faded away. Then Juan released the arrow. The bowstring snapped forward. The arrow shot through the air like lightning, racing directly toward the rabbit. And for a brief moment, the entire world fell silent.